Centuries ago, a catastrophe befell the world, and humanity fell into the hands of terrifying monsters and entities. Amidst the chaos, an unknown civilization demanded that humans be delivered into their hands, but the governing powers refused to comply and told them to kiss Truck Kun respectfully. Some countries declined because humans would have turned into monster food, so the unknown beings were referred to as calamities. At a point, humans resorted to using nuclear weapons against their oppressors, but the monsters mistook their nukes for New Year's fireworks and twerked while burning cities to the ground. Soon, everyone lost hope and prepared to die. But suddenly, an unknown force came to defend humanity, known as the 13 Constellations. 12 of these were humans divinely chosen by the holy gods and recognized as the saints, who possessed tremendous powers that were bestowed upon them by the god. However, a 13th awakened appeared who wasn't selected by the gods and was named Lee Gun, the protagonist of this story. To defeat the enemy behind the plight of humanity known as the Red Eye, the 13 constellations gathered at the Demon's Tower, and Lee set out to raid the Demon Tower with the other 12 saints. Much later, however, it seemed only 12 of them returned to Earth, and reporters were dying to find out why because the people's favorite hero was no longer there. The head of the 12 constellations stood remorsefully on the podium and tearfully announced that Lee had chosen to sacrifice himself for humanity's sake. He even burst into real-time tears and used his boogers as sunscreen. But that was all some deceitful act to please the people. In reality, while Lee had chosen to risk his life, he never sacrificed himself, and in truth, he was left behind, alone with the powerful Demon Lord. Somehow, he managed to defeat Red Eye, but he couldn't believe the nerve of those other 12 to betray him, abandon him there, and even cost him an arm. He was at least glad to have defeated the Demon Lord, but an unexpected dagger was thrown that pierced him from behind, and he turned to get a good look at his attacker but fell to his death. Before he did, Lee found out that one of the 12 saints stayed behind and stabbed him in the back, leaving him to fall in an inescapable trap. And just so Lee wouldn't be lonely, the traitor made sure he was trapped with at least one cute puppy to watch over him. Lee couldn't have had it worse, because his left arm was gone and his right was basically crippled, so he just decided to wait for death. But that wasn't going to be the end for him. Lee suddenly picked up the dagger, held on to his almost destroyed sword, and chose to deal with the ops instead of dying like a chicken. There were tons of monsters to defeat, but Lee refused to die in their hands because he'd just begun his villain arc and was determined to make his backstabbers pay. The day before his world came crashing, Lee's colleague named Hugo, the Sagittarius Saint, had told him over lunch that he was going to die. But Lee just thought his friend was one of those tarot card scammers. He thought it had something to do with him binging on dead chickens, and told Hugo not to worry about him because the amount of calamities Lee had gotten rid of was greater than what all 12 of the saints had defeated as a whole. In that light, he asked his friend if he still believed that he'd die despite knowing how strong he was, but Hugo just kept silent. Lee's backstory and the reason for his betrayal started in the 20th century, after the calamities appeared and 12 gods appeared at the dying minute, promising humans to empower them so they could defeat the calamities. They selected 12 humans to receive that power, but Lee, the unexpected 13th saint, awakened, and he hadn't even received the blessing of the gods. To worsen matters, he was so stupendously strong and amazing that he outshined the other 12 saints. One day, after they'd successfully conquered the Demon Tower, Hugo thanked Lee for helping out and being the backbone of their success, but Lee told him he could thank him by bobbing his head on his holy wood. A female saint suggested that they could eliminate the Red Eye and receive incredible rewards, while a Fatso saint added that the Red Eye was the worst, so they could get at least 100 billion won for defeating it. Joining the conversation, Lee sarcastically said they could even go ahead and hire OnlyFans models to let them do 10 strokes and finish. But the other guys were disgusted at the fact that he wasn't on board with their greed. In truth, he wanted the saints to understand that several countries were bankrupt because of the damages caused by the Red Eye, so they shouldn't expect that fat cash out. However, the Fatso said that Lee had to be a super rich MF so that he could fix that botched face of his and stop serving Halloween looks for no reason. Lee realized that even though these guys were called saints, they were really thugs who only cared about themselves. The Fatso also wanted Lee to stop running to rescue victims from trouble until there were many of them so the saints would be paid more reward money. So Lee became even more disgusted by these guys and planned to cut them off as soon as they were done defeating Red Eye. When they arrived at the Demon Tower, the saints were already thinking of how they'd be turned into fresh barbecue by the terrifying creature, Red Eye, and even Lee wasn't exempted from this deep-seated fear that was slowly eating at them all. As the demon lords deathly sighed, I was enough to make anyone wish for death. From his mouth, the monster rained forth attacks of fire that engulfed the tower and caused the ground right in front of their feet to cave beneath them. As they stood at the end of the cliff, they watched the ground beneath them transform into a boiling pot of magma, while fumes emanated from the goofy-looking red-eyed lord. At this point, the saints knew they were done for, and it was time to run for their lives, so they eventually took to their heels. However, Lee found it surprising that these so-called gods were running at the first sign of danger. So he took matters into his own hands and decided that the task of defeating the red-eyed monster would fall into his hands. And it was after he achieved it that he later got stabbed in the back and trapped with the monsters underground. Lee kept slashing until he could slash no more, but there still remained a gazillion of those ugly freaks because the trap Lee fell into was one which could summon infinite calamities. Yet, it was going to take more than a few insects to get Lee to give up, and despite the current state of his body, his eyes had a cold, distant stare that showed he was willing to do anything within his power to get his deserved vengeance. The years flew by so quickly, and it was already 20 years later, and Lee had fought every single monster off until he was down to the last one. By now, he was already covered in hair, looking even scarier than the monster he was trying to defeat, who was pleading for mercy. But Lee wasn't going to listen to the filthy piece of garbage, so he raised his big foot, which was larger than the real Bigfoot's foot, and then squashed the monster until its innards were all that were left of it. With his missing teeth that created spaces wide enough for airplanes to pass through, he was finally relieved and had a brief reality check as he realized that he could finally leave that trap he was pushed into. In the outside world, which was obviously still suffering damage from monster invasions, two men were seen running for their lives as they were being chased by some high-ranked beasts, so one of them even made peace with the fact that they were goners, since his fortune teller said he was going to meet a crazy monster. Soon, a beast leaped up at him while his friend ran off, and he was lying with his belly to the ground in pain. At that point, they were surrounded by about a dozen of those freaky beasts, and the guys wished that Lee survived the demon tower because he'd have taken care of the mess they were dealing with. But just then, the gates to the demon towers had an unexpected glow, and a bright light suddenly shone in their eyes, chased by a massive explosion. Buried under rock and rubble, the guys wanted to know what the heck they'd just experienced until one of them saw a human coming out of the now collapsed demon tower. Indeed, there was a human, and it was none other than Lee, who still seemed pretty pissed at those who betrayed him. He was now glowing differently after getting clapped by all those monsters, and then he swore that every last one of his traitors would taste death. Right before their eyes, Lee was punching and kicking those high-level monsters like flies, and he wasn't even trying too hard, so he had some god-level riz while at work. But suddenly, Lee took off from his previous spot and launched himself into their space. The guys wondered why he was attacking them, but he only recently realized that they were humans and not some dumb humans. That was, by the way, because these dudes couldn't believe that the guy just came out from the tower, and one of them even felt it was all a scam because no human could possibly survive the Demon Lord's tower, and Lee just happened to be a guy passing by. But just when they were still talking, one of the beasts showed up from the blue and stood right behind Lee. Those two diaper-soaking cards were terrified and crying again because this was the boss of the wolves. They told Lee to hurry up and get the heck out of there, but the monsters started charging. An explosion happened and became a large-scale, fiery explosion, which could be seen kilometers above the city. Things soon quieted down and the guys were shocked to find out that they were alive. But the greatest happened when they saw that Lee was still very much alive and standing with so much aura. It was at this moment they realized that he actually protected them, but it seemed the boss wolf was still very much alive. After raining a string of cuss words on the beast, Lee did some Super Mario thing and went high up in the sky, and then he descended with an insane and overwhelming amount of force down on the boss wolf. This was more than enough to make those idiots lose their eyeballs because Lee had successfully defeated the boss wolf. Now that it was all over, Lee could give his attention to those weirdos who thought they were next in the line of animals he squashed for a living. However, he simply told him to go, and that made them confused because they didn't even know where to go since they were so useless even their parents didn't want them. Actually, Lee just wanted them to buy him some food and then some clothes as well. However, these guys turned out to regret the decision because their bill from feeding Lee alone would have fed an entire continent with change. He consumed over $10,000 worth of food at a fast food joint, ate 120 servings, and claimed he was still holding back because they were broke. The dudes were losing their cool and everything, but I reminded them that they promised to get him anything he wanted to thank him for saving their lives. and then he even went on to order another portion of ramen. Later, one of the guys asked him who he was, perhaps a disciple or a divine-level captain. Lee said he just came out of the tower and ended up there, but also had a question for the boy. He had been noticing some aura emanating from him and sensing some magical power, so he wanted to know who exactly he was. His friend said that the dude was a disciple, and so he felt that Lee was also a disciple who had awakened with blessings from one of the gods. However, Lee said the gods were crap, and he wouldn't serve such silly beings, but his eyes landed on his reflection on his spoon, and then he asked if there was a mirror somewhere. Quickly, he took off his shirt and looked at his face in the mirror, and that was when he realized that his entire body had recovered, and that he was no longer looking like a practice mannequin. It was also then that he realized that his teeth were no longer the windows to the end of the earth, and that his left arm had recovered. Not to talk about those abs that you will never have. However, he found a strange mark on his palm, which resembled a serpent, and when it was activated, some strange power coursed through his body. Immediately, a status window popped up stating that Lee had experienced death and achieved the impossible, so his existing abilities would be passed onto a new body. In addition to that, his achievements from the tower would be converted into experience because he had generated zodiac skills, and now he was endowed with the strength of Ophiuchus. More and more strange things kept happening to Lee, and darkness suddenly ensued. The next thing he knew, he woke up in the galaxies and his entire body was glowing from head to toe. The strange thing was that he was on the body of the most gigantic serpent ever, and this strange dude from American horror movies even had the guts to reach out for the mouth of the serpent. It was as though the moment he touched the serpent, more power flowed into him in some breathtaking, beautiful exchange, but he found himself all curled up on the bathroom floor. The other dudes were worried for his sanity, and Lee seriously had to ask if they had seen a serpent anywhere. However, they narrated how he creepily took off his clothes, ran to the mirror, grabbed his waist, and started screaming like a mad dog. That was when he realized that he was the only one who could see that whole drama. Suddenly, the status window popped up again and Lee was stated as the new owner of Ophiuchus, while some zodiac circle opened beneath his feet, and his skills began transferring into his body. The window stated that he now possessed super regeneration, meaning any damage to his body would be restored at a slight penalty of decreasing his physical ability by 50%. Lee was only learning this for the first time, and the other saints hadn't ever shared such strange occurrences with him either. To make matters worse, he couldn't even feel the presence of any gods, but right now his body had recovered, so all he needed to do was get revenge on the saints who stabbed him in the back. In fact, thinking of his vengeance was already making his flesh really stiff. Meanwhile, people came to discover that the impenetrable demon tower had finally collapsed, and they wondered if this was the work of any of Lee's followers or those disciples who were his haters. However, after looking at some of the beasts that were defeated, they knew that the disciples couldn't have done this because even the higher-ranking saints couldn't have accomplished that. The big old question was who on earth could have busted the demon tower and taken down the monsters. They suspected that Lee may have survived and returned, although time would be the ultimate revealer. Much later, the paparazzi and their cohorts went into a frenzy as they interviewed Saint Yang, asking if there was a chance that Lee had survived. However, the fat, disgusting pig said he had no comment at all because, obviously, what else could he say? He walked off the stage and got in his limo, where he was so pissed and almost crashed his car as he repeatedly and angrily called out Lee's name. He had to question himself for believing that Lee might still be alive and survived 20 years in that deadly tower. That was way too impossible because there were millions of monsters down there, which were all high-ranking monsters. As a matter of fact, the saints barely escaped with their lives from the red-eyed monster, so it was hardly possible that anyone could survive there. Yang saw that himself, with the fact that his body was already wrecked from his powers recoiling upon him because he had never received any blessings from the gods like the 12 saints. However, in the impossible scenario that Lee actually survived, Yang had to draw in his last long smoke because he knew he'd soon get smoked by Lee. And what he didn't know was that he was the very first on the list of guys that Lee wanted to get rid of. Meanwhile, one of the 12 saints had just arrived at an airport, none other than Hugo. He immediately asked for the Prime Minister and was told that he was waiting at his residence and had a vehicle prepared for him. The bouncers that were at his back were in awe of him and the aura times infinity he had going on for him. On the way home, he got a call on his phone and was irritated because the reporters had been spreading conspiracy theories of Lee being alive. Hugo was irritated because it had already been 20 years, but he couldn't shake off his last encounter with Lee from his memory. after telling Lee that he was going to die, and after they went to the demon tower, Hugo was taking care of the monsters outside the tower according to Lee's request. He had desperately hoped that his prophecy was wrong, and that his friend would return home safely, but was met with bad news as the others returned, without any sign of Lee, and had abandoned him to the hands of the evil Red Eye. Their achievements were, however, acknowledged, and they were proclaimed again as divine beings, including Hugo himself, and this allows them to regain power and authority. He struggled to believe that Lee had died and requested a search team to find him on countless occasions. However, he was denied this opportunity by some of the other saints, such as Moleng, who told him he was simply being a delusional idiot to think that Lee was still alive. He even mocked Hugo and said that he was really worried about Lee. He could go search for him himself because no one would stop him, but that would mean that would only be 11 saints left because he'd be long gone. Hugo was at this point left in a helpless state, and now he wished that things had played out differently. Anyway, he convinced himself that no matter how powerful Lee was, he was sad because Hugo was missing his friend already. Interrupting his thoughts, Hugo got a call from the Prime Minister and picked it up, only to find that the Prime Minister wanted to know if he'd heard about the collapsed demon tower. Hugo didn't want to deal with that fake news anymore and politely said that if the Prime Minister was going to ask him to find Lee, he'd have to turn him down, because Lee died in the tower and the demon tower incident was probably carried out by his followers. He also thought the corrupt old fart was planning to use this to gather votes for the upcoming election. But the minister said he wasn't planning to do that, and it was actually because he received some news from the Korean government just moments ago that Lee's personal phone just rang. Hugo was taken aback by this news, and the Prime Minister confirmed that indeed Lee's exclusive call line just rang. The guy almost ran mad and carried out his frustrations on the poor driver, whom he asked to stop the car. And when the vehicle stopped, Hugo realized that all those phone calls he had been getting were probably from Lee. To make matters worse, he had over 30 missed calls and a voicemail from an unidentified number. While shaking, Hugo dialed back the caller, and indeed, on the other end was Lee, who addressed his friend by his pet name, threatening to find him and unalive him. While Lee was laughing like a maniac, Hugo was crippled with fear and couldn't believe that Lee was above, so he ordered the driver to turn the car around and head back to the airport. On the other hand, Lee was having fun with his new friends and couldn't understand Hugo's balls of steel, which permitted him to ignore his calls. The guys asked him who he had just spoken to, but he was more interested in the smartphone in his hands since the last civilization he ever knew was the Stone Age. He went on to ramble about technology and all that old people stuff, so the boys told him he could also use that to watch the news and use the internet. This party is curious, and he asked if he could read news articles about himself, although the boys didn't know that he was the Lee everyone was talking about. Soon the guys opened all the gossip sites about Lee and showed it to him, but he was disappointed to see that there were negative comments about him, and that some of the followers didn't even really believe that it was he who defeated the red-eyed monster because of how useless he was. Angrily, Lee almost crushed the phone in one hand, but the poor guy who owned it had to plead for his life, because he used his dad's pension to buy the first android created on Earth. He was actually pretty pissed because the 12 saints those internet trolls were all in support of actually ran away, and he was the one who defeated the monster. Anyway, he had to calm himself down and ignore them. But suddenly, his eye was drawn to a news article about his will. In the original will, Lee had stated that he would donate all his properties and possessions to orphanages and scholarship foundations. Unfortunately, Lee's wish was not followed through, and he even saw that the 12 saints claimed that he made them his next of kin so they could pay for feet pictures, although, for some reason, Hugo refused to accept any part of Lee's inheritance. At this point, Lee was done holding on to any last piece of advice he got from his anger management sensei, so he crashed that hopeless Samsung with one hand, as he swore to drop every one of those idiots and rip them from limb to limb. The poor disciple took a moment to mourn his sweet old companion, while Lee furiously wondered what to do. The truth was, even though he wanted to announce his return, he had a completely different makeover compared to what he looked like before. Even worse, if he was to try revealing that he was Lee, people would think he had lost his mind. He was deep in thought, forgetting dude who had just lost his 18th century android and was mourning it for ages because it would take him plowing his hot cougar teacher to get a new phone. Just then, Lee got a warning that someone was watching him, and some creepy aura was heavy in the air, so he stood up and said he was in to get some fresh air. The moment he stepped out, Lee saw some creepy creatures looking like angry mutant sheep suspended in the air, but he referred to them as household gods, which probably belongs to the entity Ares. Just as he thought, the system said the gods belonged to Ares and had strengthened the other divine gods, as so they were requesting for a tribute. However, Lee was disgusted because these gods are affiliated with the divine gods whom he despised terribly. But right then someone mentioned his name repeatedly, and he was surprised. But he later found out that this person was just a hater who was fed up with people talking about Lee all the freaking time and seeing his name all over the news. The ugly lump of unhealthy fat kept yapping and saying that Lee was a failure and a lost cause who didn't demand that much attention. But his badge gave his identity away, and the disciple recognized that he was a member from the Gemini group. He immediately warned Lee not to get in trouble with any of those dudes, but it was too late and Fatso had already confronted Lee for standing in his way. The poor guy knew that it was all over for some of them, especially because the Fatso puffed his smoke in front of Lee and had the guts to ask him if he was annoyed, after which he invited Lee to fight him if he really was. However, his ugly, -1 out of 10 girlfriend told him to just ignore Lee because the guy was going to piss his pants. As they walked past him, Fatso called Lee a wet kitty cat and said it was losers like himself who were supportive of Legion. This made Lee wonder why search videos were always following the weakest members of the 12 Saints, but seeing that he didn't cause any trouble, the disciple congratulated him for controlling his anger because that dude was an overranked fighter. It didn't take Lee up to a second to disappoint him when he boldly called the fat guy and his girlfriend cockroaches. They turned back to ensure that he wasn't sleep-talking or something, but Lee repeated himself with a look of defiance and was ready for whatever would follow. This made the man turn back to Lee, face him, and ask him to repeat what he said to his face. However, Lee said he could barely feel any mana emanating from this dude, and with one tiny flick of his finger on the guy's forehead, he was sent into outer space and his girlfriend couldn't stomach what she'd just seen. The other dudes were so stunned, and this lady kept acting like she was innocent. But already Lee knew what she was up to and let her know that he wasn't as stupid as her boyfriend. He flicked her sweet spot and she fell just like her boyfriend. So Lee again had proven that this couple was just a duet of mosquitoes with ego problems. The disciple and his friend asked Lee how he was able to use his abilities in the middle of the street, but he said he didn't even try because the two fools wouldn't have survived it if he did. They were shocked that he made a mess of a ranked disciples with only his fists, but Lee had already moved on to something else. He bent and looked closely at the guy's necklace, and then he took it off his neck as he realized that it was the divine artifact he'd felt when he smacked the dude. Now the question was why those guys had divine artifacts that only saints should have access to, so the disciple explained that so many things had happened in the past few years. When humanity almost went extinct from the calamity several years ago and saved all things to the divine gods and the saints, there still happened to be a need for more than just 12 people to protect the entire human race. This was why the saints went ahead to gather followers to create a divine cadre. Afterwards, the scenes granted some of these followers that pars, and those of them who were weakened were then called disciples, who ran proportionally to their power. So the hierarchy began from the SSS-ranked saints chosen by the divine gods to the SS-ranked 10 stars who could be considered saint candidates to the S-ranked divine cadre captain who commands the disciple, and then finally the disciples, who were ranked to C. Apparently those crackhead divine gods derived their power from the faith of the disciples, so they created tough competitions to get so many people into the divine cadres, and the selected disciples were given gifts from the divine gods. In the midst of the explanation, the disciples suddenly saw the household gods coming closer to Lee. His stat window showed him that the households of wealth and greed were enjoying the current situation and urging him to finish up the two Gemini disciples because their crotches were itching for violence, and they were willing to give him a useful gift if he'd end their lives. This was a rather scary situation as one of the boys realized that Lee had successfully caught the attention of the household gods, because household gods were next to divine gods in power ranking, and so if he opposed them, it would be just as though he was opposing a divine god. He quickly urged them to go ahead and do what they were asking, but Lee was already irritated about the fact that Yang's goons were only following his footsteps and trying to overfill their bellies. He got angry and stomped furiously on the ground, causing a mighty release of power that blasted off those stupid gods into the sky, asking who gave them the audacity to think they could stand him up. This was so shocking as the disciple that is called Powerful Household Goods ran away from Lee. He came to the conclusion that he was certainly not an ordinary person, but Lee addressed them by their names, Han and Jimin, asking to confirm if the guy he just turned into a semi-corpse was indeed a Gemini disciple. The boys confirmed this and said that the Gemini caste was the most influential in the country, which consisted of several prominent people. He then asked if they were all rich, and if his victim was wearing branded clothes, because all Lee cared about at that time was his loot from beating the life out of that ugly monkey. At nightfall, all three walked to an apartment where the disciple lived, so he bowed to thank Lee for saving their lives and taking them home safely. However, there was some awkward silence after his thanks speech, and Lee instead asked if the guy was going in or not because he was already sleepy. The poor frustrated disciple already knew the worst he could do was get angry, because there was no way he'd stop Lee from squatting in his house. Much later when they got in, Lee got in the shower and gave himself a haircut, which transformed him from a useless mothhead to some smoking hot K-pop idol with freshly baked abs. When the disciple saw this crazy transformation, he was beyond impressed with Lee's new look and complimented that Lee looked amazing. Lee was glad that he would no longer be losing hair as he was before because of his powers. But just then, he saw a monster fly and grabbed it, instantly turning it to dust. It was rather difficult to believe that Lee crushed it without even trying, but he just wanted to know why the calamities seemed to be attracted to him, and Jimin said the flies were attracted to him because of the dirty underwear he'd been using since he released his first jizz. Lee told him something in the house must be attracting the calamities, and it was most likely the evil artifacts that he was habitually collecting. The disciple told him that the artifacts weren't evil because they had been blessed by a saint, but before he could finish his sentence, Lee started destroying the artifacts. He told the disciple that the saints were using the mask he had to monitor him, and that they were using the musical box to steal his personal information. Lee gets angry because he realizes the saint had not only stolen his money, but they were selling evil artifacts to people and feeding off others. He told the disciple to throw them all away, and as they fought, a man arrived at the door, but as he tried to leave, a rather dashing young man appeared at the door. Lee angrily asked who he was, and he angrily responded that he was Sungyi, the owner of the house. Meanwhile, at Yang Wai's residence, things were tense because the household gods that were in Korea had disappeared, leaving the Korean branch in a panic. The man wondered who would have the balls of steel to steal the household gods, which were subordinates of the divine gods. He orders the servant to contact the other saints and find out if they've got any clue. The servant told him that Hugo was still unreachable, but the Lord told him not to worry about him because he was in England. The servant nervously informed him that shortly after touching down in England, Hugo left straight for Korea. The Lord curiously wondered whether Hugo could be making these moves because of the rumors of Lee's survival. He was shaken at the thought of Lee surviving and angrily showed a candlestick at the servant in disbelief. He yelled at him to do a proper investigation into Hugo's movements. The servant dished out more bad news, informing him that a Gemini was found to have fainted where the old gods disappeared. The poor lad was left only with his underwear, lying plotless in the streets, and according to eyewitness accounts, he got his buns handed to him after he quarreled with some handsome fella. The Lord was certainly relieved hearing this because he knew no one could mistake Lee for a handsome individual since he was literally Scarface. With the disappearance of the gods and the rumors that Lee was back and the failure of the conquest of the Spider Queen, the Lord became worried about his position and ordered the servant to prepare his private jet so he could go and find out what exactly happened in Korea with his own eyes. Meanwhile, in a Gemini hospital in Korea, the Gemini grandpa furiously demands to know who kicked his grandson's buns. The S-rank Gemini disciple called Sung-hoon tells him not to worry about it because the Gemini divine Cotter has dispatched him to take care of things. On the other hand, Sungyi had gotten a complete narration of his roommate's encounter with Lee, and found it hard to believe that Lee got rid of all the calamities and even beat a rank disciple. His biggest issue, though, was that Lee broke all the divine artifacts in the house. But Lee was so unapologetic and said the artifacts were as fake as your Nike sneakers. Sungyi asked Lee what divine cadet he was in, but Lee said he didn't have to be in any. The frustrated guy asked him instead which divine gods he was a fan of. Again, Lee saucily said he only followed himself and none of those 12 snotty-nosed gods. Sungyi was running out of patience but asked about Lee's awakened class, and Lee said he had a production class. But when he also replied that his name was Legion, Sungyi was already fed up and boiling in rage. His friend had to intervene before the craziest wrestling brawl in F's history would take place. Sungyi started by mentioning the annoying things Lee had done in their house, only to claim that his name was Legion. Sungyi was flaring up so badly that Jim had to beg him to calm the flip down because he was about to burn their miserable rented apartment to the ground. A status window popped up and told Lee that the mana of the Gemini disciple was exploding, so Lee activated his skill, Gaze of a God. With that, he saw that Sung-Yi was an awakened rank and also known as the Punisher, with S-ranked skills of Witch Burning and the Seal of Perpetual Snow. His traits were the Genius trait, Foresight, Obsession, and Idol Worship, and he had a learning effect of 200%. Lee was proud of this young one because he was also using a high-rank summon at such a young age, and he felt the guy truly deserved his Genius trait. Soon, Sung-Yi had gotten into his element, and Jim told Lee to run away already because Sung-Yi was not only a rank Gemini disciple, but a severe fanatic of Lee. Anyway, the young man warned Jim for the last time to get the heck out of the house if he didn't want to die. However, from behind him, Lee showed up and told him to stop acting like an alpha because he was always pissing the sheets at night. Quickly, Lee got him out of that state and pushed him to the floor while yelling at him for attempting to burn down the whole building simply because his temper led him to. Poor Jimin was pretty scared and wondered whether his roommate was dead, but Lee said Sung-Yi was fine. Obviously that was unbelievable because Yi was foaming from the mouth and looked like he'd already been sucked dry by the Grim Reaper. Lee yawned and turned in for the night, leaving Jimin trying hard to revive Yi all by himself. When Lee walked into the room, he saw so many statues of himself and was so surprised because that was exactly what Jimin meant when he said Yi was a fanatic of Saint Lee. Suddenly, Yi spoke up and warned Lee not to get into his room because his Lee collection was more valuable than his own life since he'd occasionally rub his meat on the dolls. But the stubborn Lee went on to behead some of the statues of himself because he couldn't stand seeing how hideous he looked. Yi tried to stop him, but he said he wasn't a crazy, demented fool, but indeed, Legion. This made Yi burst out crying and snotting uncontrollably because he knew there was no hope for his ugly dolls. The next day on the news, it was announced that 2 Gemini disciples were humiliated by a suspicious person who stripped them of their clothing and belongings. Watching this, Hugo was already tired of his maniac friend because he knew Lee would be the only one behind such. Soon, a lovely waitress asked if she could take his order, but Hugo harshly and angrily told her to get out of there because he knew it was Yang shape-shifting again. It turns out Hugo was right, and the lady was indeed that fat, ugly Yang. He leaned closer to Hugo and said he must also have thought about Lee, which was why he was in Korea, and it'd be in his interest to share what he knew about Lee. Angrily, Hugo pushed him away and called him a cultured fool who possessed the bodies of others. Immediately, a bright light shone, and the real waitress and owner of the body was confused about what had just happened. Hugo was pissed and irritated at Yang's cheap tricks, and even more importantly, he had to find Lee before anyone else would. Meanwhile, Jim and Yi were out shopping and Jimmy asked Yi if he really thought that Lee was the saint he claimed to be. However, Yi pointed out the fact that Lee looked way different compared to the saint, Lee, who wasn't a thug, but rather a savior of humanity. However, Jim said he'd seen Lee come out of the tower with his own eyes, and Yi insisted firmly on his answer, because that was what his father told him, and his father was a notable figure in Sagittarius. Suddenly, someone shouted that there was a thief, and right in between the boys, a masked thief took off at an insane speed. Both Jim and Yi realized that such speed belonged to disciples of the Scorpio who was illegally using his abilities to steal. This guy was moving like a UFO, so the store was surely going to be emptied in no time, and the thief was glad, knowing that no one could catch him, not even a saint. He'd now stacked enough and was ready to move to the next location when he was caught by Lee and taken by surprise. Form the Blue, Sung-Hoon the S-ranked Gemini disciple showed IP and said Lee was impressive because Scorpio disciples had incredible speed. He said Lee gave off the energy of a weak simp, so he should call the cops next time. However, Lee was rather offended and wondered who this son of a goat was when the building suddenly began vibrating. The thief felt this earthquake could be the perfect opportunity for him to escape, so he immediately took off, only to find that he was running into a giant spider up ahead. Even worse, this calamity was in the green zone, meaning it was deadly, so the thief had to run before getting caught up in the mess. He leaped to a great height and thought he was too sleek to be detected by the insect, but he was the most wrong person on Earth, as he was positioned right in front of the calamity's mouth. After the monster swallowed him, it stood tall in front of everyone looking for its next meal, and that was when the alarms barked loudly, announcing that there was a calamity in the mall. Apparently, that was the Spider Queen, who had tons of mutant spiders coming out of her cheesecake because no one told her about birth control. This threw everyone into a state of chaos, and things worsened when the area was marked as a red zone. So while others ran, one more boy was frozen in place, crying all by himself. However, Lee unsurprisingly showed up and put the Spider Queen in her place. He also told the boy to watch his steps, and instead of a simple thank you, the poor little one immediately ran away like it was Lee who attacked him. The issue Lee had right now was why there seemed to be more calamities in the mall than there were people, although that won't stop him from dealing with them. On the other hand, Yang seemed to have received a call reporting the calamity situation that occurred at the mall. When he learned that it was the Spider Queen, chills rushed down his spine because he and the bunch of coward saints failed to subjugate it the last time, so they placed some weak seal on it. Yang felt it was all over for him because it would be impossible for him to take down a calamity all by himself since it was a red-level calamity. In their world, the monsters or calamities were divided into 6 levels. The blue calamities were God's pure sanctuary, the green ones were safe, the yellow ones were cautionary, the orange ones were dangerous, the red monsters were the rulers of all calamities, and finally, the black ones represented the destruction of all mankind. At this point, the appearance of that red-level queen spider in the mall meant it had now become a red zone. Interrupting his thoughts, Yang's driver asked him what their next plan was concerning the calamities, so he told him to instruct that the news about the Spider Queen should be buried. Stomping his fist, Yang insisted that no one should know about it because it'd be a shame to hear that the entire multiverse got packed up by Black Friday Spider-Girl. He also added that his driver should say that all the people at the mall died and that his disciples should be sent to bury the entire building. At the mall, those spiders would just not stop coming, so Sung-hoon was already getting fed up and quickly activated his glacial poison magic, which froze them in place and made him so cocky about being an S rank that could subdue them. However, he watched as the freaking spiders made him look so useless when they instantly broke through his ice magic and headed towards him. Luckily, Lee was there to stop them and stepped right in front of Sung-hoon, telling him to get out with those dumb ice cubes he called glaciers. Next, Lee threw 3 some cans of soda at the spiders, one after the other, shoving those fat cylinders into their throats while he sliced them with his sword. He moved like the wind and delivered multiple attacks to the various spiders at the same time, while warning the shocked audience to stay in one place. This display of his immense strength made Yi realize that he may have really underestimated Lee, while Lee, on the other hand, got a notification that he'd handled the calamity, leveled up, and been rewarded with new ingredients for production. That meant he could produce new and divine artifacts with the ingredients, although he barely knew what exactly they were. Anyway, he was glad that his movements were pretty impressive despite the 50% penalty the system gave him for healing his body. On the other hand, Sung-hoon was too shocked for words because his so-called S-rank magic failed to handle the bugs. Yet Lee somehow easily breezed through them without even trying and only with a simple dagger. He wondered where a man like Lee appeared from, and then it suddenly occurred to him that it was Lee who ambushed the Gemini disciples, so he confronted him for that. However, Lee seemed a bit rattled and remembered those, so he punched the scary Gemini he beat to a pulp. So he punched Sung-hoon's cheeks and told him to shut up while he wondered how the idiot even found out in the first place. The pissed Sung-hoon said it wasn't as hidden from everyone as Lee thought, because the clothes and badge on Lee's body were the exact ones he stole from the disciples after beating the arrogance out of them. As a fact, the only people who ever wore such badges were S-rank disciples, because those were divine artifacts given to them. Unfortunately, this dimwit thought so confidently that Lee was only so strong because of the power of the divine artifacts he stole. However, Lee had only just noticed the so-called badge that was being bragged about, so he took it out, said it looked like poop, and then he crushed it. That was the climax of everything for Sung-hoon, so he called Lee a crazy son of the devil, but Lee told him that they'd all been scammed by the evil witch who claimed to have instilled powers into the artifacts. Suddenly, the queen spider roared and interrupted the conversation, so the people were again thrown into confusion. Sung-hoon was scared as heck, but Lee only got more annoyed, so he speedily rushed towards the spider and attacked the queen spider from above, delivering multiple attacks from all angles. However, this caused the ground to start caving in, so the people there were scared. For Sung-hoon, this was a shocking thing to witness, seeing Lee charge right at the spider without any form of divine artifacts. But suddenly, he got a telepathic message addressed to all Gemini disciples at the mart from the divine Cotter Captain, Choi. He commanded Sung-hoon and Yi to exit the building immediately because some Aries disciples would be burying the entire building completely. He added that Yang would personally be live at the scene, but that still wasn't any guarantee that they could stop the spider because even Yang had failed to subjugate it. so he was desperately trying to hide the truth to prevent any dirt from being linked to his name. Captain Choi then instructed Sung-hoon to use the teleportation skill that was lent to him to help Yi exit the building. This was really shocking and traumatizing to hear because Sung-hoon couldn't believe that only two of them would be safe, while there were numbers of helpless injured people loitering all around. He watched the whole chaos in front of him and saw Lee doing all within his power to subdue the Spider Queen, so he remained speechless and rattled. The captain asked if there was any problem, but Sung-hoon, with some new form of resolve, said there wasn't any. Soon enough, Sung-hoon met up with Yi, who obviously disagreed with what he was proposing, because it was stupid that in the middle of chaos, one was saying that everyone at the mall should be buried alive. Sung-hoon told him to consider it, because if it was revealed that a Spider Queen appeared in the middle of the city street, people would be disoriented. Obviously, the citizens would rebuke and rebel against the gods, and that won't be good, because humanity's devotion needed to be unshakable so they could keep getting protection from the divine gods. Anyway, the only thing that concerned Sung-hoon was that they could teleport out of the situation, just himself and Yi. However, Yi said there was no possible way he could leave his friend behind, in addition to the fact that many people were still unable to find shelter. Sung-hoon was irritated by his idiotic fellow disciple who was walking around with some decay remnant of a brain, so he said that he was not interested in getting buried alive because of an incompetent idiot. He also moved to summon his ice magic, because he was not going to disobey the orders of the captain, so he'll proceed to get rid of those people that were making Yi hesitate to follow him. At the same time, Yi was enraged and activated his flames, but Sung-hoon couldn't believe that the idiot was thinking of fighting him because they were on levels that were miles apart. Besides, he felt Yi needed to silence his conscience and make wiser decisions. Right after speaking, though, Sung-hoon was attacked by the spider and crushed into the ground. The two dudes were rattled as they watched this, so Lee came forward, telling them it was dangerous so they needed to get out of that place quickly. However, they told him that they couldn't leave because the exit was being blocked by calamities, and they either had to use a teleportation pass or get rid of all the calamities. Besides that, there were also many injured people, and some members of the Ram constellation were blocking the entrance to the building. Lee was irritated by the seeming lack of hope in the situation, but Sung-hoon managed to get up and was upset that a freaking beggar like Lee dared to trample upon him. But Lee told him to shut his effing trap up because he chose himself over the people. The imbecile countered by saying they were all fools for thinking that they could survive all by themselves, but he wouldn't partake in their stupidity because he was going to escape, even if he was the only one that would do so. Just as he was trying to activate the teleportation magic, the spider came from behind him, spun a web, and trapped him in it, after which she dragged his entire body towards her mouth and swallowed him whole, without even gagging. The two boys watching this were obviously traumatized, so Lee told them to go and take care of the injured, while he handled the Spider Queen because everything would be finished in an instant. Meanwhile, Yang finally arrived outside the building, and was asking for the updates about the current situation. He was told that the mart was blocked and the entire building was sealed, but Yang felt everything was progressing a little too slowly, and some of the guys holding up the seal said it felt like the seal wasn't working properly and something was blocking it. Suddenly, a sudden burst of energy cracked through the seals, and Lee's giant python sprung out through the chaos and intimidated Yang because his own third leg wasn't that big. Suddenly, the trapped victims ran out of the building, seeking refuge as they shared that some guy had killed all the spiders. Yang, who overheard this, found it impossible to believe someone killed it because he personally couldn't do it, so he said he'll check it by himself and ignored all the warnings of his bodyguards. He dashed into the building with some pretty fast, impressive moves and his Batman cape from eBay. The fatso soon got a reality check when he saw that the Spider Queen and her underlings were really dead, so he was pretty shocked that anyone at all could achieve such a feat when he failed to. There were still traces of the battle left, and he tried to investigate to see what really happened. But some energy kept drawing him in and became more powerful as he walked towards it. However, he was distracted by something else and found out that Hugo was present in the building, so he was disgusted and thought that it was Hugo who actually conquered the battle. Right as he was about to leave, a deep, dark, scary male voice asked if Yang's life was more bearable in his absence. Obviously, that was Lee, and Yang certainly couldn't miss this voice for anything, so he was terrified to the bones and stammered Lee's name multiple times like he was getting it real good from the back. Outside the building, an ambulance was present, so the paramedics attended to the wounded while Yi and Jimin stayed all cuddled up in a blanket, with Yi reconsidering that Lee could indeed be the famous Lee Jin he claimed to be. This was because, despite different appearances, his movements were the same. Suddenly Hugo showed up and asked Yi why he was there, but Yi was embarrassed to see his dad and wished he was an orphan for a minute. While Hugo wasn't happy that his son talked to him like he was talking to his seventh side chick, he was glad that the boy wasn't injured badly and would be fine after a few treatments. Anyway, he asked if Yi was in the area and if he saw who actually defeated the Spider Queen. However, his son started acting out like some menstruating teenage boy on expired steroids, so Hugo laughed it off, blaming it all on the stupid woman he chose for a wife. However, when he heard Yi mention Li Jin's name, he switched to game mode and asked where Li was, and if Jimin knew him. The rattled boy said Li was inside the mart and was the one who defeated the Spider Queen. At this point, Hugo asked for more details, but right behind them, a part of the building exploded, and Yang appeared from the ruins, along with Li. While dusting himself, Li pointed out that it was remarkable for Yang to attack him out of nowhere, even though they hadn't seen each other for 20 years. However, Yang was asking who this dude was because even though he resembled Li, the old guy he knew had a face botched with scars and had a different voice, so there was no way Li could be this young. He was confident and even confronted Li for impersonating the saint, but Li was confused. Yang kept on yapping about Li not knowing his place and going against him, so he should be prepared for whatever would come next. However, as he rushed for Li, he punched that fatty belly because he was upset that Yang thought he was lying. He threw the fat fool miles away from himself and landed his body on the ruins because it seemed he needed a good beating from Daddy before he would listen. Li confronted Yang for stealing his divine artifacts, his assets, and forging his will, so he was going to have his pound of flesh, as he had planned to murder one of them one after the other. He also said he would go after Yang's properties, including his house, divine cotter, divine artifacts, and the rest of the saints. However, Yang wasn't about to let Li have his way because the way Li was speaking and acting. He certainly wasn't bluffing, and the fact that he was unable to predict Li's movements, so this could indeed be Li Jin who had survived the tower. He still felt it was impossible, so he said if Li was really who he claimed to be, then he had to prove it to him. At the same time, Yang activated his full powers and summoned multiple portals with multiple swords coming out. Li was notified that the divine god of Ares, known as the Jade Emperor, had appeared before him. But he was largely unfazed because it was only a part of the divine god that appeared. With only a movement of Yang's finger, Li was entrapped and held down by multiple chains, while Yang felt this was enough to prove that he and his divine god weren't weaklings. Following that attack, he began to rain down 1,000 swords and activated his royal tool called the Divine God Weapon. Next he scattered it around the room, and Li mockingly said, "Oh, that was awesome." But this annoyed Yang, so he quickly diverted all the swords at once towards Yang, and they rained down, quietly stopping until the guy was completely covered in swords from the bottom up. Yang felt he'd successfully ended Li, so he victoriously walked over to him and said he was rather surprised to hear that Li returned from the Demon Tar, or returned as moronic as he had always been, because it was stupid for Li to think he could fight against someone like Yang, who had leveled up from the experience points. He asked Li if he thought he had been fooling around for 20 years, but right before him, Li's magic shone through the barrage of swords, and he emerged victoriously with multiple cuts all over his body, pushing through the thousands of swords and landing a hard punch on Yang's fat, ugly face as he sent him flying into the ruins. With his missing tooth and bleeding nose, Yang really accepted that Li was indeed who he claimed he was, and the injured maniac acknowledged that he was indeed the feared and revered Li Jin who had successfully returned from the demon castle. While Li's body healed up, he mocked Yang, saying his weapons smelled like the crack of his sagging buns. The loser was surprised at the speed of Li's regeneration, and said such restoration was impossible even for Aquarius healers. In return for Li surviving a near-death experience, he was rewarded with the unlocking of a skill called the 13th Sense, so he thanked Yang for being the scapegoat used to boost his strength, because he'd be the very first one to have a taste of his new power. Right then, the status window showed that the god of Ares was astonished by Li and wondered how the heck he was still alive after everything. It seemed Yang had nothing to say but stutter like the disgusting fool he was, so the god abandoned him after cursing at him. This was the first time Yang had ever seen a god disappear, so he wailed hopelessly, and Li told him not to cry because he'd only make Yang feel as much pain as he felt while in the demon castle. On the other hand, Hugo walked in with some men, and they both tried to understand what on earth happened in that building. Suddenly, Hugo sensed a familiar energy and activated his special skill of sight. which led him to find Yang Wei lying lifelessly in a crater. Obviously, he could tell that Li was behind all of this, although he wished his crazy friend wouldn't have to leave such a mess behind. The other men tried tracing the man's location, but Hugo told them to back off for a bit as he blasted through the floor with his powers and landed on the floor below, where he found Yang lying lifelessly in the ruins with some beautiful titles Li assigned to him. Hugo couldn't imagine what mess Li was about to make, not knowing his friend had already gone to visit Yang's residence to claim what rightfully belonged to him. He advanced into the building where he hoped to lay his hands on the divine artifact that was stolen from him, but there were a bunch of useless bodyguards he'd have to pass through to achieve that. Anyway, he infused a nail with his power and began shaking it, causing a massive attack that affected all the guards present. Thereafter, the nail transformed into a mud ball, which was a divine artifact and had S-ranked shape-shifting abilities. Gaining this ability earned Li access to a creation workshop, which could serve for production, repair, and disassembly. Just as he decided to head out, Yang's artifact could be felt strongly and easily detected from afar, so he decided not to leave the building empty-handed and opened the door leading to more treasures. At the same time, Hugo arrived at the scene hoping he wasn't too late, but indeed he was, because Li had already turned Yang's guild into a historical monument. Huge was really tired of his friend's wildness going out of hand, so while Li was dragging his loot, Hugo spotted him, and when they both saw each other, Hugo ran tearfully to hug Li, but he ran right past Li and hugged some dude with crutches. He went on yapping that Li should have hit him up and returned immediately to him, and yapped some more about Li's terrible condition. Already Li was tired of not being recognized by Hugo, so he brought him back to his senses with a dropkick. When Hugo looked up and saw Li's special divine artifact known as the slime, he realized that it was Li standing right in front of him, and after Li threatened to beat him some more, Hugo jumped on Li and resumed crying and snotting everywhere, glad to see his friend alive after 20 years. However, Li reset his antenna with a punch to the gut because he only wanted a hug from Hugo's mummy with the giant milk factory. Right then, however, Li was notified that the god of Sagittarius known as Apollon had appeared, and indeed a dazzling god appeared behind Hugo, who was extremely surprised to see him there. The men were confused about Apollon's sudden appearance, but it turned out that he was questioning the survival of Li and requesting to check if it was actually Legion. Hugo asked how he intended to accomplish this, so he said all he needed to do was shoot Li with a flaming arrow for a certain reaction to occur. The poor guy tried to stop Apollon from proceeding, but he failed to, although nothing really happened to Li. However, Li suddenly changed the topic to how he was going to have his revenge on Hugo and end his life because he came out to find out his house was sold. His will was rewritten and all his relics were missing. Hugo desperately tried to explain the situation, but Li insisted that he just wanted to at least shove his fist repeatedly through the rear end of Hugo's guts. He got what he wanted, and even though Hugo survived with a nice bump, he was glad that his friend was alive. However, Yang's minions suddenly showed up, preparing to get back at Li for stealing the relic. He had initially forgotten that he was on a hot chase, so Hugo asked him what on earth he stole, and he claimed it was just a few items. Obviously, that bag was certainly fuller than just a few items, and Li felt he should be patted on the back for a job well done. But Hugo just burst out crying again because he was fed up with the nutcase he called a friend. On the other hand, the guards realized that Li wasn't on their level, so they called for someone who'd match his monstrosity, and a chaotic situation occurred followed by the appearance of a supreme beast known as Pishu, the household god of Ares. As the beast landed, Li's status window warned him that all his riches and relics may be seized from him, so Hugo felt a bit worried on his friend's behalf, and he said he should throw away the things he stole from Yang and run away. However, Li had some plans up his sleeves, so he immediately signaled his slime for a sword, although that was just a glorified kitchen knife. He planned to use it against this household god, and was already in game mode, asking the sword to reveal its true form. The gush of power was so intense that even Hugo was taken aback, but soon the kitchen knife in Li's hands transformed into a snake sword. Apparently the knife was a relic and had now been awakened through the power of the Snake Master and given the element of critical strike. It was sharpened and given a higher attack damage power, while the 13th sense ability Li possessed made his enemies' weak spots visible. It was finally time to use his 13th, so when he activated it, some weeks of the Lionhead beast were exposed, and he was excited to wreak havoc. Watching his friend valiantly take on the terrifying beast, Hugo remembered the old days when Li never felt defeated by the challenges that were thrown at him, so he was rooting for Lee to put that beast where it belonged. However, he watched the beast almost crush Lee to death, so he was so scared that he came so hard to his senses. Of course, everything was alright with Lee, who emerged from underneath the beast's foot, raising it up with one hand and nagging about the stench. It was now time for Lee to throw something, and in just a matter of seconds, the beast's limb was flying right above its head. He groaned in pain and disbelief, and then got angry, so he activated his own special abilities, which involved sucking up all the riches in the surroundings. In response, Lee lifted the sword again and activated the Snake Master's characteristics with it, and then he swung it towards the beast, sending shockwaves of pain and agony, not just through the monster, but through the entire property, much to everyone's disbelief. It seems that was the end of the battle and the end of the beast, and since this was Hugo's first time seeing just how powerful his friend was, he was in awe. For taking down a household god, Lee was rewarded with an increase in his Divine God experience points and asked if he'd like to keep the Beast of Riches as his household god. Even Lee was surprised that he now possessed the power to conform household gods that only the 12 divine gods could, but the moment he tapped the household god, his power flowed into it and brought it back to life. As a consequence, Pishu was turned into a household god of the snake constellation, although it became a miserable pet seeking Lee's love and affection. For Lee, he was only glad that he had the Beast of Riches under his control, meaning he could use him to store his treasures. All of this just made Hugo more curious, and he wished to know what exactly happened to Lee while in the demon castle and why he had now gained such an ability. The moment the system permitted Lee to rename the household Beast of Riches, he didn't even hesitate to name it Piggy Bank. Later, Lee was at Hugo's place and called him a snitch because he lost his V card before him, and even got a child as evidence while Lee was stuck in the tower with monsters who were fighting to determine who gets his morning wood. Lee kept yapping and eventually stood up, acting like a hopeless, homeless dog, so Hugo told him he could stay with him because he lived alone anyway. He was mainly remorseful for the word he used earlier, and he thought Hugo's wife had left him for a much younger guy with meatballs that weren't sagging like his. However, Hugo changed the topic and asked Lee what happened in the tower because he was outside fighting the calamities and didn't know why the other saints were holding the demon lord's head instead of Lee, who defeated it. With a slight smile, Lee shared how he was betrayed by the teammates and left in a trap with endless swarms of calamities, not to mention that the red-eyed beast returned to life. Now this was a complete shocker to Hugo, so Lee further explained that the red-eyed beast they saw wasn't in its real body and the real beast was deep inside the tower, with the body of a dragon. Yet, even that one wasn't the major foe because there was an overpowered administrator who had the ability to revive dead monsters. Somehow, Lee managed to defeat him, but used up so much strength that he collapsed and died. Soon, he woke up and found no monsters, but instead realized that he was blessed with abilities. Afterwards, Lee concluded that whoever backstabbed him must have known the architecture of the Demon Tower, since they were able to trap him in a cave filled with numerous calamities. For his revenge plan, Lee planned to beat up the guys who stole his assets, but planned to specially deal with a particular person who backstabbed him. To begin with, he planned to create the weapons that he'd use to beat them, starting by creating a workshop that can create anything. The system began suggesting some materials, and in the log of items, Lee saw the Spider Queen's corrupted essence and the fragment of a calamity, both of which he could absorb. He instead chose to combine them with others to create a divine artifact, which eventually yielded the creation of an ego named the Imitation Horse. This horse functioned in such a way that if Lee wrote his name on it, he could absorb the power pot anyone he touched, at a rate of 10% magic power every hour. This was quite impressive to both of them. But Hugo found the horse to be rather ugly and Lee was pissed, because he spent tons of magical equipment to create the horse. He claimed he was initially going to help Hugo create an artifact with the remnants of the materials, so Hugo begged him and promised to make his eyes roll to the back of his head. Anyway, Lee's next plan was for them to take down the other saints one after the other, but Hugo reminded him that they'd first have to take them out of their respective territories, and that would be nearly impossible. However, Lee felt he could attract them with his special artifact stolen from Ares, known as the Safe of the Golden Fleece, which could store an infinite number of items and multiply them if Lee paid the price for that. Even Hugo accepted that it could draw out the other saints because it was one of the top artifacts in their country, but he wondered why Lee would bring it out when he couldn't use it. But Lee just brought it out because he found out that Hugo was a broke saint, so he brought the box to fund them both. With the golden safe, Li planned to multiply the artifacts they had on them so they could deal with the saints. But again, Hugo was as useless as common sense is to you and had no idea on how to activate it. So there again they were, back to square one. Later, Li suggested that they find another method. Although he had already sent out a broadcast message declaring war on the other saints, Hugo couldn't believe what his friend had done, because that meant they were only inches away from eternal death. Meanwhile, in a conference room, a guy named Oliver, the divine captain of the Leo house, had to call his subordinates a bunch of spineless insects because they failed to get rid of a freaking spider, which was the spider Queen Li had earlier defeated. He jokingly mentioned that Li may have resurrected from death, but this caused an issue between himself and the divine captain of the Ares house, Choi. However, Oliver maintained that the only one who could actually deal with the calamities was Li, as shown on the subjugation video he watched. However, the other guy said he received the biffs of other saints and got their weapons as well. They claimed with that kind of support they'd have defeated the Spider Queen, but Oliver gloated at them and Choi boldly capped that it was them who actually defeated it, thanks to the sacrifice of the S-rank disciple. Again, Oliver responded with the most sarcastic remark, and there was about to be a battle between both divine captains. Their president was somewhat disappointed and wondered when the Blue House became the den of thugs. But suddenly someone rushed in and told him to watch the news, where some pictures of Yang Wei were displayed and a short handwritten message, which was exactly the same as Li's writing, was displayed. Back at Hugo's, he was mad at Li for taking such a bold, risky measure all by himself because him murdering Yang was already an issue, but he went on to worsen matters by making the announcement he made. However, Li said that Yang Wei wasn't dead, and that he transformed him into a Teletubby for adults. At the end of the day, Li went through his power-ups and found a workshop, had the gaze of God, the 13th sense, super regenerative activities, the body of 100 poisons and the battle of God instinct, which could make him use up his remaining power to unleash the state of a god for 3 seconds. Meanwhile, Hugo was surprised to find that the teddy was actually Yang Wei, but this was all thanks to Li gaining experience during his battle, making it possible for him to restrain Yang's soul. Later, Li brought out a weapon, which was the same knife that was stabbed in his back and placed him in the trap. As he held it, Hugo saw that the blade wasn't an ordinary blade, but more importantly, he could tell that it wasn't Yang who stabbed Li. Anyway, Li decided he'd stop by an artifact store because Yang said he'd seen the engraving in the store. As he left, some men in black visited the chaotic site of Li's battle with the Ares household god. They reported their findings to an aquarium saintess, Sophie, which was that Yang, the saint of Ares, and the divine god's presence were no longer there. The agent suggested that Yang may have disappeared with all the wealth, and Sophie felt he'd run off and made a deal with some other saint. However, her agent suggested that Li could have possibly kidnapped Yang, and Sophie burst out laughing and told her sister to stop telling those jokes. The agent had no option but to apologize, and Sophie over the phone told her of her plans to visit the Divine Artifact store to sell some items in preparation for an upcoming auction. Suddenly, another agent burst into the bathroom and announced that other saints were also going to participate in the auction. In another faction belonging to the Lions, the saint, Stephen, was informed by his subordinates that Li's artifact would be on display at the Divine Auction. The moment he heard this, he dropped the barbell and smiled mischievously, saying that the artifact would certainly be his for the taking. Meanwhile, Li had just teleported to the Divine Artifact store with Yi's help, who was there to introduce him to an appraiser. The so-called man was bugging Yi, and Li noticed him checking his phone, so he asked him if his boss was bothering him, and so he returned his blade to him. Eventually, they arrived at the place where the SS rank appraiser was residing. But on the other hand, the crowd was filled with awe as the Aquarius Saintess Sophie walked in. However, she was told to wait because the appraiser was currently with another customer. But she was enraged to hear this and had to pretend to be sweet and all of that. Still, she wondered who on earth could be in there, but unknown to her, it was Li. The appraiser asked Yi who made the artifact, and Li said it was he who created it. So the man asked if he had some connection with Li and what sort of relationship it was that he had with Li. Li asked why the man insisted on knowing this, so he said that most people didn't know that aside from Saint Li's famous combative powers, he was also a legendary producer. In his lifetime, the appraiser had seen so many counterfeit artifacts, but that particular one was certainly an item created by Li, and he could feel it in his bones. This man confessed to knowing so much about Li because he was a disciple who had benefited from Li's generosity. The man was blushing severely and made Li so uncomfortable that he wondered just how deep he'd gotten in to get that reaction. Lee considered that the man may have been his student in the past, although he didn't particularly recall ever taking on a student. Anyway, the appraiser thought Lee was a wannabe student of the famous Lee, so he shared a book he claimed to have received from Lee after being recognized by Lee as a student. Strangely, Lee seemed to recognize the notebook as a book he lost, and he suddenly remembered that there was a newbie who had chased him all around China and stressed the EFF out of his life. Even though the dude claimed Lee gave him the book, Lee eventually figured out that they stole it because it had notes on production. Despite how precious the item was to the guy, Lee's handwriting reminded him of his grandpa with Parkinson's, so he could barely read anything that was written in it. Lee thanked the gods that this guy didn't actually know what was there, because it contained the list of girls he'd shared herpes with. Anyway, the appraiser soon chilled out and handed over the book to Lee because he believed a talented young man like him could make good use of it. As Lee went through it, the notebook suddenly started reacting to his power, and the system said the book would evolve into a divine artifact. Soon, it became a memory-storing artifact, and the appraiser was surprised because he'd never encountered such a unique skill in his life. Suddenly, someone rushed in to inform him that something was going on outside, precisely that the saintess was outside. The appraiser, Jin, didn't understand what the ruckus was all about because he didn't find a big deal about the saintess. Meanwhile, Sophie noticed that lots of folks were staring at her, and her insecurities made her wonder if her plastic surgeon flunked with the nose job. Also, Yi was suspicious about her sudden appearance at the Divine Artifact store because she only usually appeared in official settings. Anyway, Sophie got tired of waiting and said she would meet the appraiser and talk to him herself because he would have to purchase her divine artifact at a high price so she could afford the auction funds. When she tried walking in, the guard told her that there was still a guest inside, so Sophie became curious because she needed to know who and what exactly this guest looked like to be receiving such special treatment. She walked past him and came to face Lee, but the moment she laid her eyes on him, she knew he'd be the guy to pop that cherry. She was so attracted to him and wanted to get closer, but suddenly Lee's giant serpent lashed out at her, and she was dazed. She fell to the floor, and they all became concerned for her. But she was still trying to recover from the overwhelming magnitude of magical power she felt just now because it felt like hundreds of serpents had coiled around her. Immediately, she stood up and took off for her safety, while the appraiser wondered why she was running immediately. Lee felt she was just sick after taking some of his big meat, but the status window showed that it was because she approached the serpent fearlessly. As a result, Lee's divine power also increased because of his ability to steal divine power from gods and other people. And the system warned that if his divine power reached 0%, he would lose his zodiac and he would become weak. He asked if the lady was the saintess everyone was talking about, but the appraiser was even surprised that Lee didn't know her by face. Anyways, when Lee learned her name from the appraiser, he burst out laughing because he couldn't believe that the Sophie he knew was who everyone was calling the saintess. Compared to how she was the last time she saw her, Sophie had become a baddie and visited 100 plastic surgeons to convert her from an ugly, flat drawing board to a beautiful, hot-bodied woman. However, Lee knew that no matter how pretty she had become, she should still be the wicked-hearted one that he always knew. He considered her to be a pest and not even a human because she considered her skin care routine and Botox fillers to be more important than saving human lives. However, he wasn't the only one that thought so because the appraiser also said he didn't understand the whole hype around Sophie and why people thought of her as a nun when she was just a pretty face with a malicious heart. Apparently, he knew that she was Lee's doctor and had attempted to collect the funds gathered in his name, but she stopped in time just as government stepped to manage Lee's funds. Anyway, the appraiser noticed that Lee was calling her so casually, so he asked if he knew her, but Lee said there was no way the saintess wouldn't know him because they were old friends. Meanwhile, she still couldn't get over Lee's overwhelming power because it reminded her of the old famous Lee and gave her goosebumps so much so that she preferred to die. Anyway, she sent her personal bodyguard to return to the pawn shop and find out Lee's true identity, but the bipolar kicked in and she instructed the bodyguard to go on a shooting spree. However, the hitwoman said that the appraiser was highly valued by Virgo, and they would still have to sell their items. But Sophie was again proving Lee's point about her being a pretty face with no brain. She offered to give the guard her divine artifact and lend her the god's power, but the guard was hesitant because it was prohibited for saints to use their powers in a neutral district. However, Sophie blackmailed her since she was refusing to follow her orders, and she used some sort of hypnosis, which made the guard immediately agree to her terms, saying that Sophia's will was the will of the gods. She knelt before Sophie and received the divine necklace while stating that there was no way she could disobey the will of the 12 heavenly beings who ruled the world. Meanwhile, in the pawn shop, water slowly slipped through the ceiling and Li noticed it, so he asked where it was coming from. Meanwhile, Yi was taking a walk around the district when he realized that the ground was wet, even though it wasn't even raining. He could feel a strong presence of mana from the water and saw that his reflection had a strange appearance. But before he could do anything, a hand stretched forth to grab him. He escaped the attack, but the reflection took a physical form, and he felt a strange aura from it and was confused, wondering what it was. Apparently, many others were experiencing the same thing and wondered what strangeness was happening, not knowing that their beloved saintess was sitting pretty atop a tower and creating the creepy creatures leading to the mirror of replication. Apparently, the ones who were just replicated were just rank disciples, but with their huge numbers, they could take down her targets. Yi saw her guard and called her out for using a battle skill in a neutral zone, so he said she should cancel it right away. She told him that he couldn't complain because everything she was doing was being done under the saintess's orders and that it was the will of the gods that she carry out such atrocious crimes. She immediately activated the divine artifact, and a bright light shone through, so Yi stepped in quickly, attempting to stop it, but he failed to. The light blasted through the skies and those water figures enveloped those on the streets, so the guard moved to her next targets, which were the appraiser in the divine artifact store and Li. She commanded the figures to firstly capture the appraiser, and they immediately vanished. Yi was trapped in the water bubble and rather too helpless to stop anything from happening, so he only hoped he could find a way out of his situation before completely losing consciousness. Meanwhile, Li could see a body of water floating in the ceiling, while the appraiser confirmed his suspicions by pointing out that there was a load of mana in the atmosphere. But before he knew anything, the appraiser was attacked by the water bodies, but Li escaped the attack by a hair. However, he saw a knife pointed towards his throat, and the guard told him not to move. She also said she personally had no beef against him, but she was attacking him because the saintess wasn't so pleased with him, and it would be better for him not to act stupidly if he wanted his head to remain on his neck. Anyway, she told both of them that Sophie instructed her to get rid of both of them, but if they simply apologized to her and bought their divine artifacts at a high price, she'd put in a good word for them in the presence of the saintess. However, Li simply grabbed the knife, broke it, and stated that it was strange for anyone to boldly take out their weapons in public. The lady was shocked, and so was the appraiser, who couldn't believe that Li broke the divine artifacts of Aquarius with his bare hands. The guard was upset because she'd warned Li not to move, so she attacked him with her overflowing wetness. However, Li simply split it with one such and asked for more because he was obviously having so much fun. Seeing Li's impressive moves, the guard realized that the saintess was spot on with her prediction about Li's strength and how dangerous he was. She decided to get rid of him there, and then to prevent him from harming the saintess. So she took out the divine necklace and created some water wolves made from the goddess's slimy drip. Li was thrilled at this turn of events, so he took some knives from the appraiser, who had earlier permitted him to take whatever he wanted from him. Anyway, Li soon took off towards the water wolves and sliced through its head, after which he learned that it was the Oblivion Calling Water Chalice. He was truly excited because after determining that the beasts were levels and above, he knew he'd be getting some top-notch rewards. Indeed, he did get some pretty juicy rewards, such as the Mirror Replication Fragment, Nocturnality, Food Obsession, and Tenacious Grip. The guard was astounded at what she'd just seen, because Sophie's summons were subdued so easily. Li coldly said he hoped she had more tricks up her sleeve. But the guard knew she didn't and accepted that if she battled any more against Li, she'd be dead for sure. She immediately took to her heels and warned that Li won't get away with what he did. But no one cared about her yapping. The manager tried to understand just who the heck Li was, but right then, Yi ran in to inform Li that the disciples of Sophie had gone on a rampage, attacking people at random. He could tell that the saintess also sent her summons to Li, so he advised that they flee before she'd send more summons. The appraiser interrupted them right there because he could recall the fighting patterns of Legion 20 years ago, and they were exactly similar to Li's fighting methods moments ago. He then asked Li if, indeed, he was the famous saint, but Li motioned for him to keep quiet and smiled at him, making the appraiser almost drown in his hot jizz. He turned to leave but said he'd return for the materials, while the manager excitedly bowed and begged him to return once more. On the way, Yi asked Li why the saintess was targeting him, and if he'd perhaps made her his enemy, but Li told him to wait and watch out for something he'd show him. Thereafter, he took Yi out for some snacks and told him to binge eat as much as he wanted, but Yi felt it was so expensive. However, he had picked up a badge that the guard had dropped on her way out, and it was supposedly going to do a whole lot. It was an insignia that could be used as a card and used to store the skills of other gods. Anyway, Lee was glad he could eat for free, while Yi remained skeptical about it until someone reached out to him. He turned to see Captain Choi, but Lee wasn't so excited to see him because he was the boss that was frustrating Yi. Choi asked Lee if he was the new acquaintance Yi had mentioned earlier and the one who took down the incredible Spider Queen. With his side eyes piercing enough to cripple anyone, Lee asked how any of that was his business. So Choi said it was part of his job as a divine cotter captain to recruit remarkable talents. However, Lee asked what he intended to bribe him with, and Choi said there'd be one of Lee's artifacts up for auction. This immediately sparked an interest in Lee, as he realized that they intended to auction his belongings, so he couldn't even refuse it even if he wanted to. He agreed to go with Choi, but asked first if the auction house was nearby. So Choi said it wasn't because Lee's belongings had to be auctioned off at a proper location, particularly at the nearest auction house in the world, known as the wealthy fortress city of Drachma. Later on at the Great Auction, Sophie was seated in a very uncomfortable position and was even turning blue with worry. She was soon joined by Stephen of the Leo house, who told her if she was going to keep shivering like a wet leaf, she could just get lost or something. His manners irritated Sophie, but she had to tolerate him because his stroke game was unmatched, and he was the man that rose above even Lee, making him the safest option for herself. He told her that a certain weapon belonging to Lee was going to be his, so she shouldn't even bother to auction it out. When he stood up to leave, Sophie asked where he was going, but he said it was not enough of her business and she should just sit and watch. She had to calm herself down and convince herself that there was no way Lee could appear at such a place. Later, Hugo walked by, much to her surprise, and she was glad that a juicy customer had walked in right into her lap. For Hugo, his problem was that he didn't know where exactly Lee was, but he was pretty sure he'd show up since there were tons of artifacts there. Sophie walked up to him and asked if he was well, but he seemed to be disgusted at her sudden appearance. She mentioned that he previously was the face of the saints, but was now so withdrawn, probably because he had few disciples. Hugo didn't care about any silly thing she had to say, so he told her to shut up and get the heck out. Yet, Sophie said he was just trying to ignore her again for no justifiable reason, but doing that would make him lose his children just as he lost his wife. With a cynical laugh, she suggested that his wife was probably dead because he was incompetent as the head of his family and instead caused the home to fall apart. Already, Sophie's taunting was more than enough to make Hugo upset, so he was blazing with rage and fired an explosive attack towards her, and then reminded her that he told her to get the heck out already. However, Sophie held his hand and told him to control his temper, as she hoped he hadn't forgotten the truce they agreed upon 10 years ago. Next, she activated her powers and reminded him to ward off his status as a half-saint. But suddenly a voice from nowhere called her a pest, and she instantly froze midway as Lee pointed a finger right at the center of her forehead. Hugo was glad to see his friend arrive, and when Lee asked what he was doing there, he said he was only there to prevent Lee from creating chaos. Lee made a joke about Hugo wanting him to fill all his orifices, and then he shifted his attention to the saintess, asking why she seemed to be literally everywhere he went. From Sophie's point of view, Lee was a thorn in her flesh because she hated him and was scared of him. To begin with, he had a face even Frankenstein would reject and was aggressive and unforgiving, while always staring her down with the coldest gaze. 20 years ago, Lee stormed into her sanctuary against all the warnings of the guards because he had one mission, and that was to have a word with Sophie. She wondered why he'd suddenly gone nuts, but he simply pointed her to the wall and asked her if she was that desperate about wanting him to die. Sophie feigned ignorance about what he was saying, so Lee told her that he sent her to the rear of their formation so she could cater to people who'd been injured by the calamities. But she was back at her crib fooling around when dozens of people would lose their limbs to amputation, all because they were protecting her. Without hesitation, he dragged her, saying she'd promised to help heal those wounded people, so she had to make true to her promise. However, Sophie said she could care less if such peasants died, and they should actually feel glad that they saved her life for the sake of humanity. She asked why Lee was looking down on saints when the greater populace was already condemning them and saying they were more worthless than Trump coin, and for this reason, she was uninterested in cleaning up whatever mess was left after the disaster. Lee couldn't believe his ears, but Sophie didn't give him a chance to understand before she sent him out of her sanctuary because she had to do her makeup and look like a scarecrow as always. She quickly withdrew her hands from his grip, but Lee slapped her smack on the cheek and yelled at her, dragging her out until she treated the wounded and passed out soon after. That particular incident made her hate Lee, but that didn't stop the fact that he was the one waking her up 20 years after while she drooled like a hopeless, hungry dog and was tied up to a chair. It took a while for her reality to sink in, so she let out a loud, frustrated cry when she realized what was happening. She demanded to be released immediately, but Lee was surprised to see that the stupid female dog hadn't changed in any way over the years. In her head, Sophie planned to distribute the acidic fluid on her hand to melt the rope that was binding her to prove that restraining her was a waste. She planned to find Steven and escape with him, but Lee smacked her on the head and pointed out that her tricks were so disgustingly cheap that even a blind man could tell what she was up to. He soon experienced a burning sensation on his fingers, and this time it was Sophie's turn to call him an idiot, because she had a natural defense mechanism where her body produced acid whenever someone touched her. Now, the acid would gradually melt his entire body starting from the hand, because that was Aquarius's strongest protection skill. But to her greatest shock, Lee made a complete recovery and even showed her his middle finger, which was 3 times thicker than his third leg. Next, Lee moved on to clearing the air concerning whatever business they had left between them. To begin with, he heard that Sophie was spreading rumors around, saying she was his personal doctor, and then she was also the one who launched an attack on him at the appraisal store, and finally, she was talking a whole load to Hugo. He raised his hands to fix her in her place, but she begged him to hear her out, and he did seem to be giving her a chance, only to end things by smacking her multiple times. Hugo's biggest concern was that this coconut-brained friend of his took gender equality to a whole new level and gave Sophie as much of a beating as he'd give a wrestler. The more important thing now was that Lee's divine status was increasing by the minute, and so were his rewards, so it only made Hugo wonder which divine god's divine status was increasing in Lee's battles. Lee, on the other hand, abruptly stopped attacking the poor saintess when he noticed that she'd passed out. Again, his divine status had charged to 50%, even though the idiot didn't understand what that meant, so he asked Hugo. Apparently, that was a godly power used to manifest and maintain a divine god's power, and he could steal divine status from disciples of other divine gods. But if their power fell to 0%, the corresponding zodiac would lose their power and could lead to death. With all this, it means he could get stronger, but Hugo reminded him to ask Sophie about the dagger. Lee was pretty sure that Sophie wouldn't dare to stab him, and he had also found someone to help investigate the matter about the dagger. Already, it was time for him to head to the auction, so he bid Hugo goodbye and told her to throw Sophie into any trash can of his choice. Hugo was left with the mess to deal with, so he wondered what exactly to do with Sophie. But just then, someone walked in, and Hugo found that it was Steven, who took a second to scan the situation in front of him. He soon lost his cool and asked Hugo what the heck he was doing there. Seems it had been a while since both men met, but this meeting wasn't quite a friendly one, and Steven was dead serious about business. He said he was standing on business as Sophie's ally because she asked him to. Steven asked Hugo why he was there, and Hugo said he came for personal business, which was none of Steven's business. The Leo Saint felt that Hugo was also after Lee's divine artifact appearing at the auction, but Hugo was absolutely clueless and didn't know about it. To make things even worse, Steven mocked Hugo and said he was too broke to even afford daydreams. But Hugo got back at him by asking if he was still collecting the divine artifacts belonging to Lee. In reality, Steven never recognized Lee as a more powerful force on himself, yet he felt inferior to him and kept collecting the different artifacts he made. Randomly, Hugo asked if Steven was doing that because he thought it would make him as strong as Lee, but the man kept quiet for a second, and the next thing he was exploding in anger. Hugo didn't wait for a reaction and also activated his powers to defend himself. However, Steven stretched out his beast paw and grabbed Hugo's hand, reminding him that he was nothing but a weak halfwit and warning him against talking about Lee in his presence. The angrier he got, the more power surged through his body to the point where his divine god appeared behind him. Afterwards, he claimed to be stronger than Lee, but then some of his boys rushed in to inform him that the Gemini disciples were buying up all of Lee's items. That definitely grabbed his attention, so he quit the battle against Hugo and told his boys to deal with Sophie however they wished, because the auction was more important to him than the brat was. Before leaving, he turned to advise Hugo, saying he should warn Lee to tame his personality and lay low if he wanted to live. Soon, Steven left Hugo behind, and he stood shamefully as he observed how hurt his hands were from Steven's strong grip, which reminded him why he was a good-for-nothing. Meanwhile, in the VIP room of the auction house, the Gemini seemed to be winning more and more bids for Lee's divine artifact, and so the first session came to an end with a short break before the next session. Apparently, Lee was the mastermind behind all the wins, and he was excited to regain all his stolen artifacts, so Choi said he could buy as many as he wanted. Lee appreciated the generosity, but Choi reminded him that was all because of how talented he was. However, Yi wasn't in support of this because the items amounted to billions of hard currency. The man claimed it was alright, but went on to tell Yi to settle the bill for the grape juice, so Yi was frustrated. But there was nothing he could do because the man was his superior. However, Lee said he had already paid for everything, and Choi realized that it was his own black card that Lee used, so he was shocked because he didn't know when Lee took it. Standing up for Yi, Lee said he paid it up front because it wasn't fair that Choi would make his junior pay instead of him. The shameless Choi pretended that he was going to give his personal card, but in his thoughts, he wasn't so pleased at this game that Lee was playing. However, if Lee was actually the super rookie who defeated the Spider Queen, he was willing to make good use of him, and there was no cost for that. He then diverted the attention back to the main topic and said he rated Lee highly because he saw him to be a potential S rank or above, and there could be even more if Lee obtained the blessing of the god of Aries. While he was talking, Lee noticed that Choi was using a mind-dominating fog that others weren't seeing, which could make anyone trust him. Choi went on to add that Lee could become the successor of the saints or even be one of the 10 saints, and then he'd be extremely wealthy and possess the strong authority of the magician, Saint Aries. Now it was all down to Lee's decision to accept Choi's proposal and walk into greatness. Unexpectedly, Lee burst out laughing and said in summary, Choi was asking him to become the servant or a poor divine god. Choi was surprised at the sudden mood swing in Lee and tried to cheer him up when someone at the door said the auction items were present. This was a perfect opportunity for Choi, so he ushered them in, and a lady walked in presenting one of the divine artifacts and some certificate of authenticity to Lee. Choi was shocked to see this and asked if he bought the Lee divine artifact, but Lee simply said he'd permitted him to get whatever he wanted. Choi was super scared because he knew Steven badly wanted the artifacts, so he said to refund the item. But just then, the door was shattered by a mighty force and Steven walked in, demanding to know who dared to lay a finger on his items. When he saw Steven, Lee asked if he was the one aiming for the divine artifact, but Choi quickly apologized to Steven, saying that Lee was a newcomer who didn't know what he was doing and he'd return the artifact back to him. Steven said he was okay as long as Lee admitted to his fault and returned it. Choi was relieved and said Steven could pay for the artifacts when he was ready, but Steven indirectly said he wasn't going to pay and pointed out that was Choi's punishment for laying his hands on something that belonged to Steven. The saint covered Choi's fragile skull with his palm and almost popped his brain out of his socket, but he found out that there was no brain at all. Lee told him to stop with the crap because what he won was already his, and he could only sell it to Steven at the premium of 200 billion. Somehow, Lee's audacity shocked Steven, and he busted out laughing as he remarked that Gemini wasn't full of cowards anymore and had at least one man with balls of steel. Choi was devastated beyond words because Lee was acting like he had a death wish. However, Steven pushed Lee aside and told that he liked him for his courage, and then he asked Lee to introduce himself because he felt the meeting was destined. He went first and introduced himself using his sparky boom boom powers. Lee just looked and noticed that Steven was being so cocky because his power had increased by a bit. But he still couldn't deny the fact that Steven possessed actual combative powers that were much better than Sophie's or Hugo's. The divine god, Leo, appeared and attempted to claw down Lee's divine serpent, while at the same time, Steven landed at his hands on Lee's shoulder with his sparking, electrifying gust of power that filled the entire room. At the point it looked like Lee was done for, so Yi and Choi had a look of concern on their faces, while Steven bragged about how he'd successfully made Steven paralyzed. However, he later found out that his attack had no effect on Lee, and Lee even asked him if he was shaking the dust off his shoulder. The man was confused and asked if Lee redirected the attack with teleportation, but Lee called him a muscle-brained fool and reminded him that the skill named Rock Squall Break, which Steven used against him, was actually created by Lee, so the skill won't work on him. Years ago, Steven had begged Lee to teach him the skill so he could use it to save people. but he was apparently only using it for personal gains. Hearing the truth shocked Stephen, and he wondered how on earth Lee knew everything about him. But the auctioneer announced that the second phase of the auction would begin. Stephen was way too interested in the auction to deal with his confusion about Lee, so he headed out for the auction and Yi went to check on Lee. Meanwhile, Choi was trying so hard to analyze Lee's movements and understand how he dodged the attack, so all he could end up with was a question about Lee's true identity. Later at the auction, the auctioneer started by narrating a story of a Berlin Wolf incident that happened 24 years ago, where an unknown calamity attacked an island in Germany. It was a complete catastrophe that caused all weapons and armors to melt, and the 12 saints failed to subjugate the calamity as well. However, Lee appeared and defeated it with a special artifact, and that was going to be the first artifact of that phase of the auction. Stephen was all smiles because he was confident that the artifact was finally his for the taking, after years of dreaming about the weapon. His memory went back to 20 years ago when they arrived at the island of the calamity. 4 days since Lee entered, they still had no confirmation about what was happening inside, and they had no way to get inside because of the strong poison surrounding the island. Stephen was frustrated because all attempts to get in failed and Lee was just a fool who had no divine god's blessing who still managed to be light years better than Stephen. He wondered if it was power, subordinates, or skills that he was lacking, but while he was deep in thought, it was announced that Lee had successfully come out of the entrance. He looked up and indeed found out that Lee had survived a battle against the calamity that everyone thought was impossible to defeat. Now again he was the hero and his fellow saints were jealous. But Stephen suddenly burst out laughing and stood up while he trashed his weapon behind him because he no longer needed it. He had now found something better, which was what he thought was his disadvantage compared to Lee, and which was a weapon. Back at the auction, the lady prepared them for the revelation of the artifact, and everyone was filled with curious anticipation. But Lee already knew what was going to be shown, and so did Stephen. However, Stephen saw this artifact as the weapon that would make him the strongest man on Earth. But what no one knew was that right above the building, a monstrous beast hovered over as he'd felt the power of Lee's divine artifact strongly. Anyway, the auctioneer described the special artifact as the strongest bone club known as Big Bone, but it was now time to know who was going to get it. Lee's simp club consisted of men like Yi and Choi, who were upset that his weapons would fall into the hands of another useless person. But he didn't really understand why they had to go crazy, and he tried calming down Yi, who refused to listen and even told Captain Choi to ensure that the artifact won't be auctioned off. The beginning bid was $1,000,000, but it soon went as high as $50 million in the next 5 bids and, for some strange reason, kept getting rewards as he became more famous and also made the divine god more famous. Dude was essentially confused about why people were spending so much cash on a very useless piece of object. Yi told him to shut up because obviously that piece of bone was better than the thing between his legs. Yi run down a spiral of explanations to teach Lee just how important Legion's creations were, and they considered the very best soul men who knew what they were doing could go to the extreme just to lay their hands on these products. Of all men, the most obsessed with Lee's products was Saint Stephen, who had gone far and wide round the globe attempting to collect every single piece of artifacts belonging to Lee. For Yi, the most unfortunate thing was the artifacts mostly formed part of Stephen's collection because most of the profits went into an account managed by the government. Well, this was pretty interesting as he found out that he'd be getting profits in his account either way, so he sat to enjoy the show, even as the artifact went from $50 to as high as $100 million. But to everyone's greatest shock, Stephen bid $1 billion and the whole room fell silent. He repeated himself and said if $1 billion wasn't enough, he'd buy it for $10 billion. With this, the auctioneer called the outrageous figure for a counter bid, but no one could bid past that figure for a dumb piece of bone, not even Elon Musk, and eventually it was sold to Stephen. At the end of the day, it was announced that Big Bone was sold for $1 billion. Some janitors overheard this and daydreamed about having such an amount of money, even though that was far from their reality. However, the sudden appearance of the dragon-like beast at the window made them change their minds. Meanwhile, Stephen shamelessly flaunted his big bone and was cheered on by the hungry crowd. But suddenly there was a loud crash from the rooftop, and everyone was thrown into confusion. The dragon beast reared its head and was glad to have found the divine artifact. So when it spotted Stephen holding it above his head, it roared terrifyingly and charged towards the man. However, he wasn't going to let it go without a fight, so he supercharged the big bone and swung it towards the beast, causing it to fall back while creating a massive impact on the entire building. Steven was pleased with the presence of the calamity because it allowed him to test the power of the artifact. But soon they drew his attention to the fact that the magic tower teleport zone was falling apart. This was creating such a mess that the other inhabitants of the city saw the tower teleport zone as floating debris. The issue was that if the debris hit the ground, the floating island would collapse. All the disciples decided to gather their strength together to prevent that from happening. So they all began to pool their strengths and directed it at the floating debris, trying to get rid of it. However, all attempts failed, and they realized that their power wasn't sufficient enough to do the damage. Eventually they gave in and began to flee the scene, but suddenly the fury of Apollo was unleashed, and the debris was burnt in an instant. This was all thanks to Hugo's flames, and the people thanked him for being their hero. However, he spotted another dragon beast which slowly began to approach him. It started by releasing some bloody substance from its mouth and gradually released that onto the faces of unsuspecting victims standing nearby, drawing them in and controlling their bodies. Just then, Hugo was about to attack it with flames, but before he could completely get it, a loud roaring sound from behind startled him, and he turned to find the initial dragon beast that had attacked Steven earlier that day. Its mouth was wide open and teeth were waiting to chew on his meat in the most undesirable way. Hugo's life was almost over before his very eyes, but Lee came to the rescue and kicked the dragon away from him. But Hugo was also falling backwards and called out to Lee for help. Lee told him to be a freaking man and get a grip, and with a bit of his support, Hugo gained some stability and thanked his friend for coming through. But Lee was so disappointed that even though Hugo was a saint, he was still weaker in combat than Lee, who was just a production class dude. His taunting made Hugo so ashamed of himself, but he couldn't take Lee's meanness anymore and attacked him. So Lee got back at him and called Hum a runt who almost made himself a meal for the calamities. But suddenly they were drawn to a cry from a distance with a voice belonging to Steven, who was upset and pissed that they were disrupting his divine artifact experience. But right behind them, the skeleton dragon showed up, and Lee remembered that he had more than one enemy to deal with. However, Steven's powers showed top for the rear, and he warned them not to get in the way of his Netflix show as he demonstrated the powers of the big bone. They thought he had gone nuts and lost every iota of sense in him. And they were right, because he certainly wasn't holding back on his powers, so he warned them to step aside. With everyone almost out of the way, he created a whirlwind of destructive magical power that surrounded Lee and Hugo, using a special royal skill. While he descended, he laughed proudly at his work and watched the flow of his indestructible lightning storm. But that was just him setting the stage for a larger performance, because he wanted to test the power of the big bone all by itself and without the influence of any magical power. As they watched him, his simps cheered him and hailed him for being the saint who was so powerful that he even surpassed Lee, and so they rejoiced that they would survive after all. He faced the dragon with determination and told it to prepare for its final end, which was a punishment for going berserk and causing chaos. With all his might, Steven swung the bone towards the dragon and smacked it on the head with all his might. But that felt like a feather stroking the dragon, and there was so much dismay and disappointment written all over his face and the faces of the simps who were really rooting for him. He picked up his bone, and both himself and the dragon saw how foolish and stupid he looked. So he supercharged himself and banged the dragon's head multiple times with his fat bony club. The attacks were just annoying the dragon and had little to no destructive impact on it, so it got fed up and smacked Steven's fat cheeks until he fell flat to the ground. As he backflipped into oblivion, Steven was confused because his attack didn't have any effect on the dragon, and that meant Lee's weapon wasn't working. Meanwhile, Lee and Hog were still trapped in the lightning storm and had become agitated already, but Hugo was unable to break the skill because it was a royal skill. Lee stepped up to the challenge but threatened that he wouldn't let Steven go scot-free once they made it out of there. Eventually, they got out of the storm and decided to get rid of the bony dragon over there, but there was a much bigger problem. They realized that some humans had now become zombies under the dragon's control, because they got dominated by the beast's ability as a ploy to use them as hostages to prevent Lee and Hugo from attacking the beast. At this moment, their best bet, which Lee suggested, was to tackle the problem head-on. But Hugo would only do so if Lee had a plan, and was disappointed to find that the empty skull was just talking through the side of his teeth. While Lee was getting distracted, he was almost attacked by a zombie. So Hugo wanted him just in time, and Lee grabbed the guy's head and bobbed it on his magic pipe, while removing the bloody hypnotizing effect used by the dragon. Hugo was scared for his life because more zombies were approaching them, but he found out that the dude was no longer a zombie and had passed out. He asked Lee how this happened and Lee blamed it all on his strength. So Hugo admitted that he was certainly not going to be able to do it because he lacked Lee's level of strength. However, Lee had no room for losers, so he said he'd just take care of them by himself. And this seemed to trigger something in Hugo, who decided to protect Lee while on the job. They geared up for battle and Hugo prepared his fiery arrows to fire towards the beast, while Lee ran with great speed through crowds of zombie folks and freed them from the curse of the skeleton dragon. While he was doing this, the stupid, ugly dragon spat more bloodbines and targeted more individuals, but Lee, who thought the attack was for him, charged towards the beast to put an end to it. He, however, found out that the bloodbines were aimed at the people who were behind him. But just before they actually got more victims, arrows of fire burned them down and saved them from getting hypnotized. So Lee thanked Hugo and turned his attention to the skull face. He gathered his magical power into one hand and shot it at full velocity towards the dragon, causing it to explode into different pieces. When the beast was defeated, Lee was pretty sure that those who were under the beast's spell would soon be set free. But just then he looked at his phone and saw a strange occurrence, and thereafter the stage window repeatedly showed that he ripped apart a calamity with his bare hands and had gathered divine power. This led to him having a divine power of 81%, and since the charging rate passed 70%, the system asked if he'd like to use his power to use the battle guard instinct. Even though he didn't know what it was, he decided to give it a shot and accepted it. Coincidentally, Steven was holding the big bone in his hands and looking rather frustrated because the bone wasn't working as he faced off the beast. He wondered if it was that he failed to bring out the bone's true strength, or that he was still weaker than the beast. From a distance, Lee and Hugo watched him and his defeated followers, who wondered what next to do after seeing their hero fail so terribly. But they were attracted by a glowing beam of light representing Lee's power. It was so overwhelming that he used it to tear apart the thunderstorm barrier. As he saw this, Steven thought it was impossible and unbelievable that Lee tore through his royal skill. At the same time, the dragon horseman realized that instead of chasing out the divine artifact, he would have to get rid of Lee because he was the more dangerous person to deal with. However, as the dragon edged closer with its unbrushed teeth, Lee countered with his powers and pushed the beast down so badly that there was a massive crumbling that destabilized the foundations of the earth. As the beast fell to its death, it wondered how a human could possess such authority, and if it was even possible that there was no human at all. By then, Lee had endured enough of his nonsense yapping, so he simply raised his leg and stomped on the beast with the sole of his shoe. All of this looked like a science fiction movie to Steven because he knew there was only one person who could possess such an impressive load of power. That person was none other than Lee, his former colleague, and now that they both recognized each other, Lee asked him if he had a fun time rubbing his name in the mud. However, Steven was still in denial of the fact that this was very much the Lee of before, but Lee grabbed his fat bone and jiggled it back and forth while Steven groaned in pleasure. But soon the Lee's was so tight that he shattered the bone in one hand and said there was nothing much to it other than it being a bone. This was his payback for all the crap Steven did behind his back, and the final revenge was a massive punch to the face, one so powerful that it caused a natural disaster and sent Steven flying into the abyss. Meanwhile, Sophie had been drooling herself and eventually regained consciousness on the floor, even as her whole body hurt. As for Steven, he was actually flung into the depths of hell, and Lee could care less because he felt the guy was strong enough to survive that place one way or the other. Meanwhile, the survivors of the catastrophic attacks were glad and relieved, so immediately commanded his piggy bank to fetch him all the usable stuff. As Piggy went on about its business, Lee reminded Hugo that they had to pick up someone before leaving, and that the person's name was Sungyi. The moment Hugo heard this, it seemed some fireworks exploded in his brain, but Lee said really great things about Yi and how much potential he had, which made him worthy of hanging around with Lee. However, none of this seemed to console Hugo because he cared more about his son's safety around Lee, who was a sucker for innocent-looking guys. He desperately wished to prevent his children from hanging around me, because if they ever found out that Lee was alive, his family would be in shambles. Lee suggested that they use Captain Choi's teleportation magic, but Hugo immediately dismissed the idea and tried to make an excuse, saying that these Gemini guys must have made Lee fed up already. After considering what his friend said, you realize that these dudes had been putting him off from the get-go, and he said he initially wanted to keep an eye out for them, but now he realized that they weren't worth it at all. But just then, a voice from behind called him. Dad, and Hugo knew he was toasted because that was his son's voice. He had just realized that Lee was indeed alive all this time. He turned in horror and wondered why his son was there, but Yi demanded the truth in addition to all the nonsense his father was saying about his kids. Just then, the Bloodbinders crawled up on the floor, and a demonic voice called out to Li while sending one of the Bloodbinders in the form of a sharp blade targeted at his face. There was little to no time for Li to react, but thanks to his lovely slime, who swallowed the blades, Li was saved. It turned out his divine artifact had gained poison resistance, but he was so pissed at his stupid toy for eating random crap on the ground, so he tried to shred it apart. However, Hugo was quite worried and wondered if those Bloodbinders came from the remnants of the skeletal calamity, because things could have gotten really dangerous. As for Yi, he recognized the slime from a book which said it was Li's artifact, the incredible ability Li had shown up to now, the brutal magical power, and the only person his outcast, weak father would ever be friendly with. This was certainly the moment, and when he accepted it, Yi was overjoyed and cried tears of joy. Back at the Leo Divine headquarters, the executives were holding a meeting where they discussed the sudden disappearance of the Castellan, so Oliver ordered that the Gemini, who were known for their excellent detective skills, should be hired to help them search. However, his subordinate asked him if he felt the Gemini would want to help him after all the ruckus he caused some days back over a fight that was certainly won by Li. Oliver thought the stupid guy was thinking through his leaking brain because Li was defeated before by the Gemini and he wasn't as powerful as Steven. A phone call interrupted, and the ringtone was essentially a confession of someone's love for Li. It belongs to a girl named Yuha, the vice castellan of the Leo group who was a member of the committee. She apologized, but they told her to be a bit more serious because the castellan was missing. But she could honestly not care less because he was nothing but a dumb fool, and there was no point in looking for them because they completely relied on their tough bodies to survive, so they will be good after all. Oliver reprimanded her and said she should be taking more responsibility as the vice. But Yuha was so interesting in her phone as her brother had just sent her a message stating that they had a new uncle who was super cool. She immediately turned to go home and told them all to do their best or whatever, leaving them all in the state of confusion while Oliver lost his mind and his sneeze. Meanwhile, at Sophie's residence in the sanctuary, she was flooded with tons of questions from reporters who wanted to know more about her kidnapping and about rumors concerning Li's return. Bouncers desperately tried to hold them back because she needed rest and promised an interview in the near future. However, Sophie was truly not in the best shape and had essentially lost her mind and cursed out Leo, while torturing her face with the cheap face mask she bought from a yard sale. Later on, she passed through the hordes of reporters who wanted to find out more about her kidnap. But a green light on her necklace suddenly glowed brightly, and so many of them thought it was a terrorist attack. Turned out to be a holographic message from Li, who said he wasn't dead and commanded Sophie to tell everyone the truth about what happened 20 years ago. Sophia was in a distraught state because she didn't know what to do. In the first place, if she told the truth, the other saints would be after her head. But if she did not, Li would not let her live peacefully. She was completely losing her mind over Li, who was having the time of his life, planning to cook instant noodles after a stressful day. On the news, it was announced that Sophie didn't make any official statements that day and chose to remain silent, cooped up in her residence. A guy who was watching the news and probably one of the 12 saints saw this to be a very bad omen. The next day, at Hugo's house, he and Li played archery and Hugo got some really nice shots, but so did Li, although he just had to thread the path of a gigachad. He was having fun with it, but Hugo felt he was only there to make fun of him. Later, Yi walked in with water and a towel for Li, acting like a hopeless simp while his father fumed jealously at their unnecessarily close relationship. He tried to ask Yi for some water, but the boy told him to go get some by himself. While Hugo wailed on the floor, Li was checking the status window for his new abilities. The first one was that he had created a private palace, which was confined because the space level was too low. That space, known as the Sanctuary, was a territory in which Li's constellation Sable resided, and where he could exert and maintain his strength. He stepped in, and there were parts of the sanctuary with mages, so the status window permitted him to manage the sanctuary and even move the piggy bank in if he wanted to. After bringing in a human household member, Li would successfully have strengthened the sanctuary's power. He thought deeply about which human household member to bring in when Yi walked in and said something about both of them leaving together. Hugo asked where they were off to and Li said he had a lot of people to meet. The first was Choi, who still wanted to know if Li was interested in becoming a Gemini. But Li was seriously digging into some chicken's laps and wondering whether Choi was just being jobless or what. Anyway, Choi said recruiting talented people was his job, and there was also no way Lee planned to escape with millions worth of Gemini's money that he used up at the auction. The brief moment of silence made him realize that Lee was absolutely planning on running with Gemini's money. In his thoughts, he realized that even though this pestering was so annoying, it was a good chance for him, because after dealing with Yang, Sophie, and Steven, the next in line was the Gemini queen he described as a rotten little witch. He eventually agreed to join the divine cotter of the Gemini, but on one condition, which was that Choi would give him the badge he was wearing. The moment he altered that monstrosity, the guards were so pissed because the saint gave Choi that badge by her own self. But Lee wasn't interested in talking to those useless guards. He mentioned the fact that that badge would grant him access to benefits that come with being a member of Gemini's cotter, and outside the empty promises of the divine captain, Lee was interested in getting something tangible. He asked him just how much he was willing to invest in a talent, and Choi told him to give him some time to think things over. It seemed to those guys that their leader had lost their mind, but Lee wasn't even being patient with Choi and told him to hurry his decision because he had another appointment right after that. Meanwhile, Yi had been texting Lee while he waited at an ice cream place, where he planned to meet both Lee and his sister. He wondered if Lee would like to lick his ice cream, but even more, he wondered just how excited his sister would be after finding out that Lee was the uncle he had spoken to her about. He also planned to hand over his dagger to Lee for his signature, but right then someone snatched the dagger away from him, asking him why he was playing with such a dangerous knife. It was some dumb blonde idiot named Shiwoo, who was a ranked Gemini disciple together with his cohort. Yi asked him to hand over the dagger right away, but Shiwoo warned him to watch his tone. It seems the guy had made it a habit to be a bully to Yi because she was a little older than him, so there was nothing much Jay could do in retaliation, not to mention the fact that Shiwoo was the son of a Libra saint. Obviously the guy knew his benefits and continued being a bully because he could get away with that. So when Yi demanded his dagger, Shiwoo's boys pinned him down to the ground. They were so loud that they attracted so much attention from the crowd, and Shiwoo asked Yi why he was attached to the dagger, and whether it was something that Lee created or it was a memento of his sleeping mother. The moment Shiwoo mentioned Yi's mother, his anger overwhelmed him, and suddenly, Lee's dagger was activated because it was responding to its owner being in danger. The weapon shone brightly, and gradually Lee appeared from the dagger, trying to squeeze himself out of it while Shiwoo blasted his pants due to fear. On the other hand, Yi was happy to see his uncle, and he wondered how Lee knew he was there. So Lee explained that it was probably the consumable summon skill he left in the dagger, which was activated and summoned him right away. Anyway, the problem right now was that those idiots were disturbing Lee, so he was going to instill some discipline in their bones so they know how not to mess with anything belonging to him. Let's rewind to moments before now, before Lee was summoned. He was still waiting on Choi's response when Choi agreed to give him the budget in exchange because, to the captain, that was a very small price to pay for winning a big catch like Lee. Besides, he planned on recovering the badge much later, so as he gave it to Lee, he told him to take good care of it. Now it was time for Lee to sign the contract right before his unsuspecting eyes. Lee disappeared, and they brought his heavy bill for the thousands of chickens Lee ordered. Back at the Gelato Cafe, Yi's bullies lay in an unconscious state on the floor, and Shiwoo in particular got a serious punching from Lee. But the brat said he was a rank Gemini and the son of a company chairman, in addition to the fact that he was the son of a Libra saint. However, Lee genuinely didn't care about his status and kept punching him until he looked like freshly baked buns. The guy was half dead on the floor, so Lee told him to get up and receive some more beating. However, Shiwoo was irritated and gotten enough humiliation, so he got up and activated his magical defense, which came from a certain weird bull. He directed this force towards Lee, but that was illegal because he was using his magical powers in a neutral area in public. Those present tried running away from it, and Shiwoo seemed to be having so much fun causing havoc with his window teeth. But Lee sounded so disappointed when he found out that there was no special skill behind all the theatrics Shiwoo was displaying, and he said the boy's weak flames won't even light a cigarette. Lee soon suppressed the boy's magic and obtained skill data from the bull, but the system advised him to craft a divine artifact with the data he obtained to protect it from getting corrupt, so he agreed to turn it into a skill and activated the Polaris's bull skill, which yielded so much fire that Shiwoo was scalded and a great explosion occurred that banged Shiwoo against the wall. Lee threatened the fool that if he ever touched Yi in his life, he'll be barbecued on the spot. He also told Yi to call him the next time anyone laid his finger on him. But right then, Nooner ran into the room and came to meet a mess waiting there. But Yi told her not to worry about that because standing right before her was a man who'd conquered countless calamities, a hero who saved humanity over and over again, and the protagonist of the movie they'd watch repeatedly back when they were really young. That was the man, Li Jin. But it was pretty unbelievable to Yuha because Li was way too handsome for the man she knew 20 years ago, who was covered in scars. He'd been in the Demon Lord's castle for over 20 years, so it was expected that he'd be in a way worse physical state. Anyway, she brought herself to accept that what mattered most was that Li was safe. Her brother told her they could hear her nasty uncle fetishes in her head, so she rearranged her thoughts and introduced herself, after which she thanked him for rescuing her brother. However, Li told her not to worry about all that because, as far as they were Hugo's kids, they were his niece and nephew. Yuha was glad, but she soon had to ask him for a favor, although she was quite hesitant about that. Li thought it would just be an autograph, but just as she started asking him, a fiery monster got into the building, and he thought that was Yuha's special request. But she immediately got into battle mode and charged towards the beast with her spear, telling Li to hold on for her to submit a proper proposal after getting rid of that dangerous beast. It was as if seeing Li had flipped a switch in Yuha, but Li was only concerned about the fact that she was bringing him a proposal of the sorts. In the city, an announcement was made to make people aware of the presence of a calamity, and to advise them to evacuate into shelters. Already, there were tons of calamities present, but Yuha remained unstoppable as she moved at the speed of light, delivering multiple attacks at once to the calamities so she'd be rid of them really soon and return to submit her proposal to Li. But seeing that there were more and more calamities showing up by the second, she decided to get rid of all of them at once and activated a power move kickstarted by spinning her spear at a really fast speed, after which she flung it into the air at an insane velocity towards the monsters. Once it was up, she uttered 2 words, Phosphonous Lotus, which set the sky ablaze all at once. Watching her perform, Li was pretty impressed because unlike her brother, Yuha was an incredible fighter. She noticed Li watching her and was distracted for a minute, so a monster took her by surprise and almost snapped her head off when Li ran and quickly grabbed her to safety. Meanwhile, the queen monster was surprised that they escaped its attack and planned to take them as pets, but Li promised to make her the fuel for his gas cooker. When they spotted the humanoid monsters, Yi and his sister recognized them to hail from the fantasy race, and Yuha was determined to stop them. But Li told her not to worry about the monsters and focus on keeping the surroundings safe. He said he was entrusting them with the surroundings and asked them to also trust him to deal with the monster. They agreed and went in their separate directions, although they'd be working as a team. Much later, the humanoid monster lashed Li with her serrated whip multiple times, and he kept wanting more, although she was just having fun and was glad to have a pet she could train so easily. Over and over again, she lashed him with her whip and tied him down tighter, but just when it looked like Li had given up, he broke himself free of the binds and said she was all style and no substance. He asked if that was all she had, and she proved herself by breathing a destructive amount of flames that exploded like a nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, Yi was using his magical strongman to protect the citizens from serving as collateral damage, and at some point, he declared their mission successful because they'd evacuated the last of the citizens. But Yuha was somewhat distracted because she was thinking about how the fantasy race was much stronger than Li because they were the most dangerous race and were rated higher than red-ranked monsters. Again, she was worried that Li could be suffering after effects and injuries from his prolonged stay at the Demon Tower, and she planned to help him out. However, Yi reminded her that Li warned them not to be at the battleground, but she just stubbornly ignored him. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Li had received a notification from the system, asking him to choose his subject for strengthening. He selected some cube in the flames as his subject for strengthening, and the monster lady was not even getting him anymore, so she decided to put an end to his madness before he even started. However, while she was talking nonsense, Li appeared from behind her and activated a skill named Thunderclap, which tormented the monster with endless lightning, while she caught some of the strikes in her hand. She quickly took off into the sky and pinned Yuha to the wall after slicing her neck, and then she directed the giant fire-spitting monster to feast on Yuha and devour her. It flew towards her with its claws facing her, but Li climbed up to attack the monster and sent it flying into the sky, causing it to land on its back. The humanoid monster was shocked to see that Li flung the monster with his bare hands, but Li threatened that if she touched Yuha one more time, that'd be the end of her. Meanwhile, the lady saw the eye of the serpent and almost made her blast her pants. and she was terribly terrified because she knew she'd soon get devoured. It was a shameful thing for someone from the fantasy race to be defeated by a mere human. So she went full mode into her elements and released an intense amount of mana so powerful that it almost blinded Yuha. The monster said she disliked her new form because it made training impossible, but she had to because Lee was an enemy worthy of her Hell Wings state. The monster planned to roast everyone to ashes, so she activated her Calamity skill and a giant fiery eagle appeared, swooping her towards Lee as she grabbed his hands. As she saw her uncle get sucked into the flames, Yuha was terrified and called out Lee's name. However, it seemed the flames weren't burning him because he'd activated his fire-touching vinyl gloves and stretched them with the Hell Wings flames. This blocked attack surprised the monster lady, who couldn't believe that Lee used a mere vinyl glove to block it. Meanwhile, Lee's super regeneration skill was activated, and he swore to make the witch pay for setting his city on fire by turning her into his smithy flames forever. She called this a humiliating act, but Lee asked if she was looking down on his vinyl gloves. Just then, the system notified him that her Hell Wigs were way too impure to become members of his household, so he'd have to purify them first. Thanks to his fist, Lee could simply get the purification done with just a punch, which he repeatedly delivered until there was no response. He wondered why she wasn't getting purified, but it turns out that she was dead already. He turned to her Hell Lizard, but the animal quickly surrendered to Lee and was turned into his slave forever. He suggested a bunch of names for the Hell Lizard, and the final name it decided upon was Torch. Since the whole battle had come to an end, Yi and Yuha came to check up on their other uncle, and he had to ensure that they weren't hurt anywhere. Yuha then reminded him that she had to make a proposal to him, so his mind went back to the conversation they had when she said the same thing, and this didn't look like anything Lee wanted to hear. Before he said his mind outrightly, Yuha told him she was pretty sure he didn't sacrifice his life in the Demon Tower, as the rumors said, because she always doubted their narrative. This was because even though they claimed that he sacrificed himself, Yuha found it strange that Lee was the most powerful saint among them all, yet he somehow was the only one who didn't survive the battle against the deadly Red Eye. She unfortunately couldn't investigate the matter due to lack of sufficient evidence, and so she pondered upon the matter all these years, only to become convinced on this very day after watching Lee fight. As a matter of fact, she was now convinced that Lee wasn't sacrificed at all, but rather gotten rid of with some malicious intent. He listened to her and commended her for her sharp instincts, because the girl's deductions were actually spot on. He told them about his ordeal in the Demon Tower, and they were shocked that he was actually betrayed by one of the very saints that everyone was looking up to. Both siblings were extremely surprised and disappointed to hear that the so-called saviors of the world were actually murderers, and they'd attempted to get rid of Lee, who was humanity's last hope. However, Lee told them that the reason was far beyond what he was seeing, and that the saints hated how much he excelled far beyond them and even defeated Red Eye all by himself. As a matter of fact, they now had the perfect opportunity to get rid of him now that the boss of monsters had been done away with, and all they needed to do was get rid of Lee so they could rule the world however they deemed it fit. This was still all guesswork though, and Lee wasn't actually convinced about the real reason behind the betrayal. He wasn't happy as he realized that all those years, Lee had been trapped all alone in the demonic tower, and that other saints had taken the glory for his own conquest. Lee urged them both not to cry over spilled milk because he'd have his revenge against the saints in 100-fold. Just then he picked up his phone and learned that Sophie was planning an urgent trip to Korea for a press conference, so he was prepared to deal with her as the last thing on his schedule for the day. Later at the conference hall, loads of reporters were waiting to see Sophie and hear whatever was so important for her to say that she held a press conference in Korea. Some speculated that it could be about the incident at the auction house, while others felt it would be about Lee's rumored reappearance. Either way, she was going to be spilling some big tea that day, and even for Sophie, whatever she said that day was going to leave her in the most messy situation, so she wished she could just run out of the conference room. Unfortunately, that was going to cost her something huge, given that Lee's divine artifact was around her neck, and she wasn't particularly sure what effect it would have on her if she defaulted. Anyway, she had to do as Lee commanded so her head would stay on her neck, because even though the other saints were a problem, Lee would end her life faster than all of them combined. Hesitantly, Sophie announced that the reason for holding the press conference was to unveil certain truths about what happened 20 years ago. She ensured to remind them about the whole incident, and then went on to confess that the real person who defeated the Red Eye Demon Lord was Lee. Some people simply took in that new bit of information, But it suddenly occurred to others that the saints had been capping for 20 years, and it wasn't Steve or whoever that subdued the demon lord. This made them question their entire lives, and they eventually popped the big question, which was whether Lee was alive. Sophie swallowed hard for a second and eventually responded in the affirmative, but some mysterious dude behind her said there was no way it was possible. She turned and saw a guy named Gene, who was the Capricorn saint and had the darkest aura around him and looked like he'd come to suck her soul. So naturally, she became pale white, and Gene said there was no point in her continuing the press conference anymore. Sophie tried so hard not to lose her composure in front of everyone, but Gene drew closer to her and told her to shut up with whatever the heck she was trying to announce because she literally had one job: to sit pretty and act like a Barbie in paradise. He threatened that if she didn't keep her mouth shut, the whole world would see him ripping her mouth on live TV. And then he pressed a button and took over the press conference, announcing that Sophie was being blackmailed to testify falsely, but he'd step in and handle the situation. He apologized for ending the press conference so abruptly and for wasting everyone's time. But the reporters still had questions about Lee Jin, so he exuded his evil hypnotizing aura and said the same old thing that Lee died 20 years ago. And if he really was alive, all he needed to do was prove that by revealing himself. He asked why Lee wasn't showing himself, but a reporter asked him who was blackmailing Sophie and why the culprit was particularly mentioning Lee's name. These questions and more were running on the minds of the reporters, so they only hoped Gene had something tangible to say. He was becoming irritated by their persistence, so he began to activate his deadly magic to put them in check. But a familiar voice from behind him asked if he was trying to murder all the reporters. Of course that was Lee, but before the guy could do anything, Lee kicked his ugly face and blasted him off the stage. When Sophie saw this, she was doubly traumatized and started running for her life because Lee had somehow managed to show up there. Gene was trying so hard to recover, but Lee didn't give him a break and even compared Gene's face to a decayed Egyptian mummy. Lee held out some weapon looking like a tail, belonging to a strange teddy-like creature, which was the unarmed torch. Anyway, Lee asked Gene who gave him the authority to end the press conference. But Gene returned with a question, asking Lee about the origin of the tail because it belonged to one of the deadliest monsters, which was recently subdued. However, Lee told him to stop messing around because he'd cloned himself. Gene was surprised that Lee could tell his special abilities, so he asked to know who the guy was. Lee responded quite dramatically that he was Lee, the famous saint, and this took the entire audience by surprise, with a moment of silence ensuing after. However, they all burst out laughing some minutes after because that was one heck of a joke, given that Lee was on the front cover page of a botched magazine. Gene calmly said Lee was skilled but delusional for thinking he could impersonate the 30th saint, but before he finished that statement, Lee whipped his brains out and said they all needed to get their flat buns whooped, and that they could come for him if they weren't scared. This quickly turned into a chaotic situation as the crowd fled from Lee, who'd lost his mind, so Sophie, although still scared, decided to seize her chance to escape in the commotion. However, Lee appeared from nowhere and said there was nowhere she was going until she'd fully confessed the truth about who the saints really are underneath the masks and out of their false pretenses. However, Lee was suddenly informed that some really dark energy was headed their way, and indeed the whole hall was filled with an intense flood of magic. Sophie immediately said she could sense the presence of a divine god, and Gene's divine god spoke up about how he didn't expect Lee to survive the tower. But now that the dude was back, it was time to welcome Lee the Mafia way. Will Lee ever find out which of the saints stabbed him in the back? If you'd like to find out in part 2, send "Snitches Get Stitches" in the comments section. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.